4 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Actually, you know, the more you look at it, the more similar these two stories become. Imposing a ban on smacking would be rather difficult. What are you going to do? Sort of publish a phone number for 4-year-olds to ring if mum gives them a smack bottom for not eating their tea? And similarly, if you were born after 2000, you're going to have some people who are right on the cusp of the smoking ban. So someone who was born literally the day before you will be allowed to go into a shop and buy cigarettes, and you won't. So they are tricky. But sometimes legislation's not about the things that are effective, isn't it? Sometimes legislation is about messaging. So I need today to be careful that the second hour of the programme, which at the moment is going to be about smacking, doesn't sound exactly the same as the first hour of the programme, with just that one word difference, smoking being swapped for smacking. It's a shame there wasn't a big story about smartphones around today. That would have appealed to my slightly childish verbal enthusiasms, because everything we talked about would have had S and M at the beginning, if you pardon the pun. Smoking, smacking and smartphones. Starting the day with a bit of S&M on LBC. Yes, I'm fully aware of what I'm saying. Don't worry. But it's PMQs later as well, which I suppose involves both sadism and masochism, depending on what your political proclivities are at this point in time. So the reason I'm talking about the smoking story today, and didn't yesterday, that's partly because attention was inevitably focused on the Middle East yesterday, and will no doubt be again. But I like the dust to settle a bit sometimes. I like to have room. I like a little bit of space sometimes to think about what it is about a story that I find interesting. So I love you. You know I love you. I love you deeply and forever. But if I come on air at 10 o'clock in the morning and say, are you for or against? I don't know that we engage each other particularly. There'll be plenty of people happy to ring in and contribute. But are you for or against? And I could even keep a tally or something like that. And it's not actually very interesting. What is interesting about this is the relationship between regulation and freedom. The relationship between regulation and freedom is at the heart of much of what we call politics. How free should you be to harm yourself? Or, I suppose, with smacking, how free should you be to harm others? And with smoking, of course. In fact, the key difference, you can't really do passive smacking, can you? So the key difference with these two topics would be the harm that you do to others by smoking in their presence. So this idea that government exists to protect us from harm, and sometimes even to protect us from ourselves, is one that I find intuitively difficult. I'm a fan of government intervention. I think that those of us born with privilege don't realise. Do you know what story I always remember? And if you've been listening to this this nonsense, if you've been listening to me for a while, I don't think I've picked up on this before. But I was remembering a story yesterday when I was thinking about this and trying to, if you were trying to explain to someone who was open-minded enough to acknowledge that they might be wrong when they say, oh, we don't want government and we don't want the state and we don't want this and we don't want that. And people who say, you don't need lessons in childcare or you don't need lessons in this, that or the other. There was a story years ago, it may even have been before I started doing this, and it broke my heart to smithereens. It was one of the saddest things, one of the saddest stories I've ever read. And it was a story of a couple who'd had a baby. And they were not, this is long before the current cost of living crisis, but they were struggling. They were really struggling financially. And if memory serves, the court found, because for reasons that will soon become clear, they ended up in court. The court found that they were committed and completely loving parents, but the cost of baby food was prohibitive for them. So what they started doing was liquidizing their own dinner and giving that to the baby shortly after the baby was weaned. And the salt content was such, I think the baby might have died. Certainly I think the baby died. Certainly got very, very ill because the salt content of their normal food. So they'd literally put a plate up a dinner and then liquidize it and feed it to the baby. And I don't know why. Some stories just get you, don't they? And of course, what that story brings to this conversation is the importance of recognizing that sometimes we do need almost protecting from ourselves. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that some people need to be taught stuff that we think is self-evident. And it does often break down on a right-left thing. That this right-wing libertarianism, which usually means I really want to be able to do whatever I want to do, and therefore I'm an enemy of regulation. Sort of think of someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who would struggle to tie his own shoelaces. But if he hadn't been born with several silver spoons in his gob, goodness only knows what he would be doing for a living now. But he certainly wouldn't be close to a position in which he gets to influence the direction of an entire country. But these people who just hate regulations because they've never really progressed beyond resentment at being told by nanny to finish their peas or whatever it may be, that is so dangerous when you think about it, because it negates the existence, it denies the reality of people who don't know. People who do need a little bit of help. And somehow that, for me, plays into the smoking story. Because I believe that I should be free to do things that are bad for me. Right? If alcohol was invented today, do you think it would be legal this time next year? If alcohol was invented today, do you think it would be legal this time next year? I don't. Smoking, I have smoked over the years. Not for a while now, but the freedom to do something that harms me is a really odd principle, isn't it? You can't ban everything that's harmful because, you know, you'd be banning almost everything as a net. What, you'd be banning chips, you'd be banning crisps, you'd be banning sweets, you'd be banning fizzy pop, you'd be banning alcohol, obviously, and you'd be banning cigarettes, and they're only doing one of those. But they've also banned or rendered illegal, for example, heroin or cocaine. You can't pop out now and buy yourself a nice bag of meth, crystal meth, and smoke it up before tuning into the big show. These are illegal acts. These are crimes. But why? Because I think you should be free to do stuff that's bad for you, especially if you really enjoy it. But I don't, do I think that? Because I approve of the smoking ban. And I don't think that you should be able to pop to Morrison's and buy a little bag of crystal meth before breakfast, or indeed after breakfast. So where is this line? Isn't it a strange one? All of this is a very roundabout way of moving towards the question I said I wasn't going to ask you, because I am going to ask you that question. But I've demonstrated, I hope, that you need to think about it a bit. Okay. Richard suggests that if milk was invented today, it would be illegal. It'd be a bit hard to invent milk, Richard. I mean, what came first? The milk or the cow? So the rule is mad, right? The rule is absolutely bonkers. The more I think about it, the more bonkers this rule becomes. If you were born after 2009, you will not be allowed to buy cigarettes. So when you reach your majority in 2027, which is not far off, or even 2025 actually, I think, isn't it? So it's next year probably. You walk into a shop and a shopkeeper, we should probably speak to a couple of shopkeepers. A shopkeeper in 30 years' time, in 30 years' time, a shopkeeper is going to have to distinguish between a 46-year-old and a 47-year-old. I've probably got the numbers wrong. Don't at me. So you're working in your shop, and you're still selling cigarettes in plain packaging. I was once sold clotted cream under the counter in Devon. Did I ever tell you they weren't supposed to be selling clotted cream? They didn't have the right credentials and the right certificates. But he sort of made sure the coast was clear. I said, "Do you want to buy some clotted cream?" I said, "Yeah. Well, have you got the good stuff?" He goes, "Yeah, I got some really good stuff here." He looks at it and he pulls it out from under. That's what cigarettes are going to be like. But if you're 47, you will be allowed to buy them. Well, so all the 46-year-olds will be waiting outside the newsagents, saying to the 47, "Excuse me, mister, can you buy me 20 Bensons?" To the 47, "Excuse me, mate, how old are you?" 47. my fine young fellow. Oh, Split, can you buy us 20 Bensons, please, mister? Is I don't know, £400 it'll probably be. It's 400 quid. Can you buy me 20 Bensons, mister? So it's an absolutely bonkers piece of legislation. And yet I think everybody sensible recognises that it's also good. So how can something bonkers be good? 0345 6060973. I'm not going to shake that image now of a 46-year-old tapping up a 47-year-old outside the 7-Eleven to say, excuse me, mister, can you get us 20 Benson? How can it be both bonkers and good at the same time? In fact, I'd go further. I think bonkers and brilliant. Because it is brilliant. The Daily Mirror's headline was the one that stopped me in my tracks today. I forget it precisely, but it was something like, Parliament votes for smoking ban, but Tories still want more death. And you sort of thought, yeah, and that is how it breaks down. The Tories that voted against it, some of the more prominent ones, are essentially doing what they like to call virtue signalling to libertarian potential donors. So they're trying to keep the mad think tanks that propelled Liz Truss into Downing Street on side. They're trying to keep the kind of people that make secret donations to weird lobby groups that call themselves think tanks, also make big donations to political parties. Liz Truss has shown that you can grease a politician's passage all the way to Downing Street by keeping these mad Tufton Street vampires and client journalists on side. So people like Kemi Badenoch and Honest Bob Jenrick, they are calculating that the path to the leadership, even though a significant majority of Tory voters think that this is good politics, think that this is a good idea, they've calculated that the path to the leadership still involves a sort of Truss 2.0. Vice signalling, you could call it. Thank you, whoever texted that. But it's bonkers and brilliant at the same time. I want you to explain it to me, okay? 16 minutes after 10. There's no way this will work, but I really, really like it. And I suspect you're the same. Unless you don't like it, in which case, in many ways, you can go straight to the front of the queue. But you need to explain yourself, and you need to explain yourself well. We are bringing in a rule which, oddly, is pretty much the only original idea Rishi Sunak has come up with in the last 2 years. And he has had his, I think, biggest rebellion yet from his own MPs, whose positioning in the polls is pitiful and who are actually on the wrong side of history on this. When you look at every single constituency, every caucus of voter, except, guess what? Conservative Party members. Not voters, but members, the people that elect the next leader, potentially, ultimately. So it's absolutely mad. In fact, even Boris Johnson has called it absolutely nuts. And when's the last time I agreed with Boris Johnson about anything? But I only agree with him to the end of that sentence. It's absolutely nuts. Full stop. But it's also brilliant. Why? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. So how can something that is impossible to implement simultaneously be the right thing to do? And if you're on the other side of this, I'm still winnable. How do we draw the line between the things you are free to do to yourself that are bad for you and potentially bad for others, diesel cars, and the things that you shouldn't be allowed to do to yourself because it's bad for you? So I don't know if you're familiar with 2000 AD, the comic. They were quite ahead of the curve on many, many things. Judge Dredd, you probably know the figure of Judge Dredd. I think Sylvester Stallone made a film. But they had this very prescient phenomenon in their pages. It was set in 2000 AD, right, which was 24 years ago, but it was written in the 60s and the 70s. So it seemed like this distant, far-off, futuristic scenario. And they had I remember it actually, and I think that if a kid was caught smoking, Judge Dredd would take the kid to this place, which was like a tent for all the smokers. The only places in 2000 AD that you were allowed to smoke were these massive tents. And it would, I mean, you barely needed to light up if you were in them. You may have seen something similar at airports in Greece. You barely needed to light up if you were in one because you could just walk in and breathe in everybody else's fumes. And they were absolutely disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. But they could have done that, right? They could have just made smoking for everybody harder and harder and harder. But they haven't. They've made it illegal for anybody born after 2009. And yet somehow I really like it. So tell me why you don't. I am winnable on this, oddly, because fundamentally, I don't know whether it's my sort of stubborn boarding school attitude. I want to be free to do things that are bad for me. So, well, there you go. I've waffled for long enough. Should we just open up the phone lines and let you waffle as well? I think it's one of those mornings, isn't it, really? Go on, give us a ring. Share your thoughts. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And if you hit those numbers now, you will get through. And you can have a go if you want. If you want to keep it a bit simpler, why not alcohol? Why smoking but not alcohol? It's 20 past 10. I'm also still broadly in favour of the decriminalisation or the legalisation of cannabis. So it's not as harmful as tobacco, but in terms of civil liberties, I just want your help today in pinning down what these distinctions are. But I have to tell you, Emma's done a Google, and I was right about that story. It was 25 years ago. A little boy called Lee Elders, 3 months old, died from salt poisoning after his young parents fed him adult food because they could not afford expensive baby meals. Next time you hear some predictable right-wing blowhard banging on about how you don't need to teach people that, it's all obvious, or if you don't need that, just think of little Lee. That absolutely heartbreaking story. His mum, only 18, from Doncaster, said at the time, "We were just giving him what we thought was extra good food to boost his diet. I never suspected, as we are now told, that it was poisoning him." 23 after 10 is the time. Let's start with the smoking. Let's start indeed in Barcelona. Sebastian is there. Sebastian, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you doing?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
Good. Well, it's the subject of government harming, stopping people from harming themselves. When I was 14, I started smoking behind the back of the science block at Hampstead Comprehensive School, as a lot of people did. And, it was all a bit of fun at first.
Yes.
And then, the rest of my life, not the rest of my life, until I found recovery from addiction,
yes.
Because it did. It literally, cigarettes led to cannabis, led to sniffing glue, to Tipex thinner, to cocaine once I got older, to I never took heroin, strangely.
Well done.
Although the opportunity was, I begged someone to once, but they didn't let me because they didn't have enough.
Really?
Yeah. So, but that's how an addict rolls, right? Once you're taken by it, that's why people sit around in groups going, "Hi, I'm Sebastian, I'm an addict," right?
Yes.
Because, they might not say Sebastian, obviously, it's a bit of a poncy name.
Bit weird if they did, wouldn't they? If every single addict in the country was called, or indeed if every single addict went to Hampstead Comprehensive School, that would be terrible for Ofsted. But on we go.
It's all good.
Yeah, just watch your mouth a bit, if you would, Sebastian. We had to dump that because a few words you can't say on the radio. But that's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I got a bit loose out here in Barcelona, probably.
Yeah.
So the thing is that essentially, look, back to the point. There was you used to be able to go into Fowler's, and I sound like an old man here, but you used to be able
just hang on, let me help you focus a bit.
Buy a single cigarette.
Yeah, but you can go into Fowler's and buy a bottle of wine still. So what is it about tobacco that deserves this treatment when there are lots of other things? I mean, and you've given a list of things. No one's ever banned glue, or indeed Tipex thinner. So what is it about tobacco that deserves this treatment when so many other things which do us harm and to which we can become addicted do not deserve this treatment?
Well, personally, you're burning a carcinogenic substance and it's going into your lungs, which is instantly harmful. I mean, you wouldn't take I suppose you're not allowed to really put a knife in yourself or put anything that is definitely going to harm you. eventually, one way or the other, and others. This is another thing.
So
about
it's the
addiction.
popularity of it that it's become a victim of its own popularity. If smoking was as popular as glue sniffing, we wouldn't be having this conversation, would we?
Well, smoking is a lot. You mean if glue sniffing was as popular as smoking?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, I think we still would be having this conversation because it's, in a way, it's not the item. Often, it's well. I can only talk for myself. I can't talk for other people with regards to addiction, right? Because there are so many different levels of it.
But you can. I only want you to speak for yourself. Why tobacco and not any of the other things? Like whiskey.
Well, it was readily available. Gary Finley, this
like
little
whiskey,
kid,
like booze. Why tobacco and not booze for the ban?
Because no, I agree. Also, there should be limits on booze as well. I mean, personally, for me,
there are limits on booze. There are age limits and things like that. But I want to get down. I want to zone in on this tension between being free to do things that harm us. Would we ban skydiving? And I know you could say, and I'm not making light of it, but there are recorded cases of people landing on others when skydiving and doing them harm. But obviously you're not immediate. Passive skydiving isn't really a phenomenon, is it? So, Dad, what is it? And give me the libertarian argument, because I think that 20 years ago you'd have had me on your team. I mean, the world has turned. It's turned even more on smacking. But I think 20 years ago, you can't ban people. This is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. I should be free to do something that's bad for me. Michael's in Watford. Michael, what's going on?
Well, yeah, I think you're completely right, and I think it's to be honest.
I can't be completely right. I'm confused. I don't know what I'm thinking. You can't ring. I can't. I say I don't know whether I'm coming or going this morning, and then you ring up and say I completely agree with you, James. So do you tell me what you think, not what you think I think.
I think that, to be honest, it's laughable because the solution is right there, staring at everybody, and for some reason no one mentioned it yet. You should be completely free to do whatever you want as an adult, right?
Yeah.
Yes, we should monitor how old you are when you start smoking, drinking, doing this or doing that 100%. You shouldn't be banning anything all the way because you're an adult. But why should we or the NHS pay in a situation where you start damaging your health? So I think it should be the other way around. It should be, if you have health-related issues to smoking, then why should the NHS pay for it?
What about football?
You should be charged.
What about football? What about if you break your knee playing football? Why should I pay for that? I don't play football.
Well, because the football is not basically all the way harmful.
No, but it is if you've broken your knee.
Not everyone.
Lots of people smoke and don't get lung cancer. Lots of people smoke and don't get lung cancer. Lots of people smoke and don't die.
But they are going to have other health issues, not just.
How are you going to know? How are you going to know which health issues are linked to smoking and which ones aren't? What about the people who have health issues born of passive smoking? How are you going to prove that it was passive smoking and that they weren't actually smoking? Everyone who turns up at hospital under your glorious rule is going to say, I can't believe it. I've been sitting next to Bob for the last 30 years. He smokes 40 a day and now I've got emphysema. So you can't charge me. You should charge Bob. He was the smoker. I was just breathing in his secondhand smoke. I think the reason why no one has suggested this before, Michael, is because it's a bit silly.
I mean, someone I should have called in. I should have actually processed it first before calling in.
Never do that, Michael. Promise me. Never. I'll be out of a job. People start processing and thinking everything through before they ring in. 10:30. And again, my initial response to that is warm. Yeah, you're right. If you are going to... I always remember a bloke called Bob. Bob is a lovely bloke. I had this weird job before I could drive in Norwich, and I was living in Cambridge. And for some reason, Mrs. O'Brien charged me with finding somewhere for us to live. I found a lovely cottage in the middle of nowhere. We've been living in London, and I just got off the showbiz beat, and I just thought, this is going to be amazing. It's wildlife. And then Mrs. O'Brien could drive at the time, and she was still working in London. And we got there, and we moved in, literally the night we moved in, because we'd been living separately for a couple of months when I started this job in Norwich. And she said, what are you going to do? How are you going to get to work and stuff? I said, well, and I'd actually managed to rent a house for 6 months without thinking about it. So I ended up putting a local taxi driver on retainer. He would meet me every day. I paid a little less than what I would have paid, but he was called Bob. Worked out of Ely in Cambridgeshire. And I always remember he once said to me, he said, you know, James, he said, if it were absolutely guaranteed that all the taxes from my fags went directly to the NHS, he said I'd smoke twice as much. I said, what? He said, if you could prove that all the taxes on my fags went directly to the NHS, I'd smoke twice as much. I really would. I'd smoke 40. I smoked 20 a day. I'd smoke 40. He'd been around. He'd travelled a lot, Bob. That's why he had this quite a strange accent. It didn't really pin down in any precise location. But he kind of has a point. Although I'm not sure how helpful it is in our quest this morning for complete clarity on the question of when is it good for the government to stop us doing things that are bad for us, and when is it bad for the government to stop us doing things that are bad for us. It's 10:32. Amelia Cox has your headlines. I love it when you all make the same joke. Simon Garrett says, that poor taxi driver must have had a long day having to get to Cambridge via Somerset each day. And you didn't say your smoking friend, writes James. Bob was the same fellow who sold you clotted cream in the West Country. This is from Jimmy in Fulham. Your impressions of them both sounded exactly the same. Yes, all right, you're all hilarious. And Tamsin says, did Bob spend a lot of time in Pakistan? No, he didn't spend a lot of time. They were Guy on the Isle of Man. Amazing that Bob from Ely was also the Devon clotted cream seller. They were very different accents, actually. The clotted cream seller spoke like this. He did. Would you like to buy some clotted cream, he said. And Bob from Ely said, oh, James, I'd smoke twice as much if it went directly to the... That's not the same accent. One's Norfolk, one's Devon. Yeah, all right. Take it up with someone else. I'm busy. 25 to 11 is the time. We're talking about the smoking ban. Trevor's in Wokingham, or Smokingham, as perhaps it could be called today.
Yeah, Smokingham.
Yeah.
The leafy suburb.
Cheers.
How are you doing?
I'm all right. What's on your mind?
I was just listening to you talking, and I think
that's a relief.
You're drawing equivalent to sort of smoking and alcohol, smoking and chips, smoking and football, but there's an order of magnitude, and I don't agree or disagree. I kind of like my freedoms.
Yes.
But there's an order of magnitude to the damage that smoking does.
Yes.
You know, the people that it kills versus alcohol.
Yeah.
I think it's 4 or 5 times.
Is it? Really?
It's some crazy number. Yeah, there's an order of magnitude to long-term.
There's not really such a thing as moderate smoking, is there? I mean, there is technically a thing, but you're just as likely to get ill as not just as likely, but there's no, but you know what I'm saying, no benign smoking, as it were.
It's polar. You could smoke one, or your gran that smokes 80 a day for 50 years and was absolutely fine. So I think there's that. There's secondary smoking, and you probably remember Roy Castle as well. I remember Roy Castle, played trumpet in bars, ended up getting lung cancer.
He did. His widow, Fiona, used to listen to the show. She used to get in touch quite a lot, actually, with the programme. And for younger listeners who don't know, Roy Castle was a big, big television presenter when we were children, but he was actually originally famous as a jazz trumpeter, and he was one of the first sort of poster boys almost, wasn't he, for lung cancer as a consequence of having never smoked but having spent a lot of time in smoky environments.
Yeah. So I think I understand and you can't, greasy chips, I get what you're saying, ban greasy food, but I think what I was saying to the person on the phone that answered was, if you ban smoking tomorrow, if no one smoked tomorrow, no great harm would come. If you start banning food groups, food is necessary for people to live, and some people will, chips will be what they'll need to eat. It's when you look at sort of the cost of food and ultra processed food. So
no one's ever killed anyone smoke driving, have they?
No, they haven't.
That's not quite the zinger that I was hoping for, but it's a pertinent point that Paige makes on a text. So there are harms linked to drinking that don't apply to smoking, but no one's going to get past the numbers game, are they, on this? You're here with the numbers game, Trevor.
Yeah, to a point, but then if I think about something that's comparable to smoking, that's bad speeding. No one really needs to speed.
I thought you said breastfeeding then. I thought, good God, this has taken an unexpected turn.
Oh, everyone needs to do that.
No, I thought, what's he on about now? It's all gone a bit UKIP. But no, you said speeding. No one needs... Yes, so speeding is illegal.
So no one needs to speed. It kills people. It's attributed to X amount of road deaths. But again, it's not necessary. You could argue the point that, I need to go a bit faster every now and then. Speeding, smoking, two things. If they're stopped tomorrow, fewer people die, people are healthier,
downside.
No one's going to go hungry, and I think if you ban alcohol, actually, I agree with you. Drunk drivers.
Well, that's already illegal. Actually, quite a lot of people are pointing out that is already illegal. But you could eradicate it, or come a lot closer to eradicating it, if alcohol was illegal. But it doesn't feel the same. I am indulging in whataboutery, which is something I often accuse other people of. Smoking is unique. Do you know what might be closest to it, despite your comments about greasy chips? Sugar
or salt.
Yeah, well, I think you need salt. I don't know that you need sugar, but sugar, the way they've pumped sugar into everything. I mean, like granulated formula sugar, not fructose and stuff. But that I don't know. Do we live in a world where someone tries to ban sugar? Thank you, Trevor, in Smokingham. It's 10:39. George is in Bristol. George, what would you like to say? Hey. Hello.
Yeah. I just heard you talk about glue sniffing and all of that. And I think smoking is kind of unique, as you just said, because there are no sort of auxiliary benefits to
That's
smoking.
The word I wanted, auxiliary benefits. Are there any auxiliary benefits to alcohol?
It has a social function, doesn't it?
So does smoking.
People not quite the same, though, is it? Because you don't sort of go to the pub to have a cigarette.
Smoke.
And, exactly.
No.
And people don't sort of enjoy the feeling of a cigarette on a night out, or it doesn't loosen you up in the same way as alcohol might do. I mean,
oddly, it does briefly if you're addicted, but that's not really a challenge to your analysis,
really,
is it?
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 33.
That's an interesting age. Why
do you say that?
Well, because you are 20 years younger than me, and 20 years older than a 13-year-old, which is the age roughly many people begin to sort of flirt with tobacco. So if we were doing this generationally, you're the midpoint, you're the control, and you didn't grow up with cigarette smoking being as normal as breathing in public spaces.
Yeah, that's true.
And if I was your age, I wouldn't have any of this sort of residual libertarian position about, well, hang on, I should be free to harm myself, but because I think it's born of familiarity. We would go to pubs and nightclubs, and the majority of people in there would be smoking for the duration of your time indoors.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Germany actually most of the time.
Oh yeah,
and there in the pubs and clubs, people smoke all the time.
Do they
it's
still?
Completely normalised.
I didn't know that.
You'd be surprised. Really.
Oh, yeah, I am surprised. You live and learn, eh? Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a consensus emerging. But the consensus is directed at that specific question of why this is different from other substances. So why did these Tories vote against it? We can throw in a little bit of politics on this one. What is this libertarian position that people like Kemi Badenoch and Honest Bob Jenrick apparently espouse? That's quite interesting. It's the biggest rebellion, I think, that Rishi Sunak has suffered. 2 ex-prime ministers voted against it, or certainly opposed it. I like the comment from the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins. She said, there is no liberty in addiction. But I haven't even checked yet, but I can guarantee you that various vampiric institutions in the vicinity of Tufton Street in central London, they will be opposed to this. And, of course, when it is reported, when someone finally manages to produce the evidence that these outfits take money from the tobacco lobby, everyone carries on booking them for their programmes anyway and treating them as honest brokers and inviting them to write comment pieces for the Daily Telegraph. But apart from people who are secretly funded, although occasionally the truth slips out, by the tobacco lobby, who's got a problem with this? What's Kemi Badenoch? I mean, hard to understand what's going on in her mind at the best of times, but on this occasion, what is going on there? Does she not give 2 figs either way, but she thinks there might be more political capital in opposing it than there is in supporting it? Dan is in Tamworth. Dan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First time caller, long time listener.
Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. I just felt like picking up the phone today because I am absolutely delighted that my son will never legally be able to buy tobacco if this goes through. I've always been terrified of my son, because obviously when they get a bit older, teenagers, you cannot control what they're doing behind the bike sheds, etc.
No.
And I've lost relatives to smoking. I grew up in the 80s and everyone smoked. Every room was smoke-filled.
Yeah, I remember.
I've watched people literally lose their life because of it. And I'm absolutely delighted. I am by no means a fan of the Conservative government, but I think this is one of the most wonderful things that they've ever proposed.
Even though it's bonkers. Because when your son, what is he now? He's 9?
He's 9, yeah.
Right, so he'd have to find someone, in 2000, who's 15. He'd have to find someone 6 years older than him. So when he's 50, and he's hanging around outside the newsagents, and if he can find a 56-year-old to go in and buy him 20 Benson, then he's laughing. So you see what I mean about how daft it is on one level.
Absolutely. I mean, but you also see underage kids all the time vaping these days.
Yeah, vaping is a bit of an issue, isn't it? That's the big problem now.
Yeah, they're not legally allowed to be buying vapes. They do find a way, but as far as I'm concerned, whatever extra barrier is there for my son can only be a good thing.
I really like it. It's nudge. Is it nudge theory? Whatever it is, that you just change behaviour. So the behaviour probably of people who are allowed to smoke, people who were born in 2009 or before 2009 but don't currently smoke, they are massively less likely to take up smoking now because the culture around it is changing so much, and this is a massive contribution to the culture change, so that your boy will not grow up thinking that it's rebellious or naughty or cool or any of the things that tempted our generation to do it when we were teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone was doing it when I was at school. Luckily, I never, I had really, my parents smoked, but they always drove home how bad it was and how they couldn't stop. So I never took it up.
That's parenting 101. Do as I say, not as I do. 10:45 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Don't forget that it's Wednesday, and also they're back from holidays, so there is PMQs today. Natasha will be joining us at shortly before 12 to have a look at what is likely or unlikely to come up. And it's a tricky one today, isn't it? The polls continue. It's reaching that point now where I heard someone on with Nick this morning. Forgive me, I wasn't sure who it was, but yet another Tory who's leaving at the next election, trying to make a case, bless him, for the Tories winning the next general election. Never say never. It is a possibility, but the misunderstanding of what happened in 1997 is so widespread. We're hearing exactly the same conversations in 1997 about they're not that into Labour. They've just had enough of the Tories. But history's a strange thing. People can be very, very forgetful. They're back. So what it's going to look like now, PMQs, well, we're just going to have 6 months of this weird, stagnant purgatory in Parliament. Or is something going to give? Is something going to break? We will find out. 10:46 is the time. It is 10 to 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've got quite a good unhinged headline for you today. It's a double whammy this. It's an unhinged headline and then it's got a very clever comment from the history guy, Dan Snow. I'm not just calling him the history guy, like a history guy, like I'd be the Brexit guy. That's what he calls himself. He is known as the history guy. He's a brilliant bloke, Dan. So I'll do the unhinged headline first. Okay, let's do it.
Unhinged headline.
Exclusive. Liz Truss says the power exercised in Britain by unelected people is a scandal. She's given an interview to a columnist at the Daily Telegraph called Alison Pearson. This is, if you're a fan of the original Ghostbusters, this is like the streams crossing, potentially. I don't know that this should have been allowed to happen, that these two particular streams should have been permitted to cross. But cross they have. And Liz Truss has shared this gem. The power exercised in Britain by unelected people is a scandal. To which Dan Snow, the history guy, has responded by saying, very winningly, she was appointed by a hereditary monarch without recourse to a general election. This is the thing that I'm finding quite fascinating about Liz Truss. She's got a book out, by the way. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's as if she operates in a universe where she's never come across Liz Truss. Do you see what I mean? It's to be there's you can be a bit detached from reality and you can be a little bit delusional. I mean, look, Brexit is the ultimate in political delusion, continuing to pretend that it isn't failing to deliver any of the things that people were promised it would deliver, regardless of whether or not you want to pretend that you like spending more money for food and not being able to move to Spain anymore or whatever it might be, or you know. She seems to operate in this mad space where she doesn't know anything she's done. I was trying to make sense of it last night, and this is the best I can do. It's as if she's in one of those Hollywood films where they have the same date every day. Like the woman, Jennifer Aniston, wakes up and she can't remember anything, so Ben Stiller has to woo her anew every day. That's not an actual film, but it nearly was. Do you see what I mean? So Liz Truss says things that seem to display a complete ignorance of anything Liz Truss has ever done. And that's the best example of today. The power exercised in Britain by unelected people is a scandal, says a woman appointed by a hereditary monarch without recourse to a general election. How do you do that? How do you do that? How can you go, power exercised, unelected, and not realise that you were unelected, essentially, certainly on a national level, and that a hereditary monarch, also unelected, kind of nodded you through? Anyway, 10:53 is the time. I'm tempted to ask what they've been smoking, but that would be inappropriate. Although I think we could probably all agree there is a historical anomaly. There's a certain absurdity to tobacco having been legal for all of these years while cannabis was illegal. I suspect that in the not too distant future, that situation would have been almost completely reversed. James is in Ely. Have you got in Cardiff, though, not in Cambridgeshire?
Hey,
I was going to start doing some accent-based banter with you, but thankfully I spotted...
I would love to. It's been really strange.
It's the wrong Ely. What would you like to say? What made you pick up on this one?
Well, I was talking about it. I just think that any sort of limit on restriction just tends to usually sort of disproportionately affect the lower classes, I find. And
or poorer people, certainly.
Yeah, poorer people. Yeah. And obviously, I mentioned I'm from Ely in Cardiff, which is one of the sort of lower income suburbs. One of the worst ones, really. And I've grown up here for 25 years. And I've seen different sort of implementations come in with regards to different sort of vices that people have. The Welsh government, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, introduced minimum alcohol unit pricing.
Yeah.
That didn't change anything. All that did was just the people who I see who are the most affected by alcohol abuse. You know, I haven't seen any sort of change in the amount of alcohol they're consuming.
That is anecdotal. I think the science suggests that did go all right, that introduction.
Okay, well, anecdotal is also...
But that's fine. I mean, anecdotes are interesting.
Say again, sorry?
Anecdotes are interesting, and it hasn't helped anyone in your circle that it was ostensibly designed to help.
Not in my circle, just people I might happen to be judging, watching, whatever. Yeah. But also, another point I had was I'm a civil engineer in my final year of university, and it's a completely irrelevant topic, but my dissertation was on the 20-mile-per-hour implementation that the Welsh government imposed in September 2023.
Yes.
Changing all 30-mile-per-hour roads to 20-mile-per-hour roads.
It wasn't all of them, was it?
Well, that's the one of the things I talked about in my dissertation.
Okay.
Is it going to be all of them? Is it not? Anyway, as part of my dissertation, I interviewed 40 van drivers at the delivery company that I work for.
Yeah.
And I asked them 10 different questions. One of the questions was, during off-peak times, do you notice the implementation much? During peak times, school hours, rush hours, whatever, do you notice the effects? People said that during peak times, not really. They're not really...
I'm going to have to urge you to be relevant. I hope that doesn't sound rude.
No, that's the thing. I am coming into it.
Yeah, but you need to hurry up. You need to get to the relevant bit quicker.
Right, okay. Well, basically, people don't like being told what to do, which is
That's
what my
true.
survey results found.
Yeah.
I found people were deliberately exceeding the speed limit more at 20 miles per hour.
Yeah, still not seeing why it's relevant to the smoking.
You need to speak to people at LBC, mate, because when I told her this, she was buzzing. She was happy to get me on the call. So,
okay, that's not true.
Right, okay then.
They're absolutely adamant that you didn't tell anybody about your thesis at university being great.
Right, okay.
So, can you in a sentence say something interesting?
Free Palestine.
Okay. Ewan's in Halifax. Ewan, what would you like to say?
I want to. Hi, James. I'm first-time caller, nervous and all that.
That's only me. You can't be as bad as the last bloke, mate. So it's win-win, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'm young. I'm only 19, but my dad smokes. My dad's mum smokes heavily. Right. Loads of mates I have not heavily smoke, but smoking out, drinking very socially.
At your age and smoking cigarettes, smoking tobacco, not vapes.
No, some people do both. They do either or. They'll sometimes, the majority of the time, they'll have a vape on them and also smoke cigarettes throughout the night. But basically, I don't necessarily think that. I think that banning's a good thing. I've seen the effects that it has on like people I know and the coughing and all that type of stuff. But I don't think that people that want to smoke and people that basically are allowed
they'll
to
find
smoke
a way
their age,
if they want
find a way. Yeah,
but the numbers are going to be negligible. You see, that's the point. I think you're right, but that's why I'm talking about a culture change. I don't think anyone is going to be going to court, certainly not in that catchment of born on December the 31st, 2008, at 1 minute to midnight, not allowed. It is allowed to smoke, and then 1 minute after midnight, not allowed to smoke. That's never going to happen, is it? But the world in which both of those people live is a world in which smoking has just become something a little bit odd and weird and dirty.
Yeah, I agree, and that's it's like the devil's advocate in the sense of basically it's one, smoking's good for the economy because it's regulated and we tax off it a lot, but obviously you don't know where it goes, like your story about the taxi driver. But also, we're always going to smoke nonetheless. I think it's good, and I agree with it because I don't want to be getting lung cancer and all that type of stuff from people smoking around me, but I think that if people want to smoke, they're going to find a way to smoke, no matter what happens, I think.
Yeah, except that they will be a tiny, tiny number. And also, who's going to be that person who actually, that person born after 2009, I'm determined to smoke. I'll leave you with two thoughts. The first is of that 46-year-old hanging around outside a petrol station asking people, passing adults, how old they are until he finds a 47-year-old or indeed a 48 or a 5 and gives him some money and asks if you can buy me 20 Bensons. And the second is, someone else has just pointed this out, is our friend in Ely a moment ago, reminding us why we don't do motoring conversations on this programme. And who'd have thought that in a conversation about the smoking ban, someone would be able to pop up and remind us why radio phone-ins about boring motoring-related issues are generally anathema between 10 and 1. It is 11:03. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We could have gone with smearing, I suppose, couldn't we? This Angela Rayner story still being desperately inflated by right-wing newspapers and various politicians. Matthew Parris in the Times today is actually worth reading on the subject. Matthew Parris, himself a former Conservative member of Parliament and been around the block quite a few times. He's a columnist, and I know that you're probably going to text me now and say he's the bloke that wrote this thing and you shouldn't praise him. But I like columnists who take me by surprise. Some of the things he's written I've found pretty gross. And some of the things he's written I have found extraordinarily good. But that's good. I don't like the columnist. You name a columnist, I'll tell you what their view is on a given subject, even if they've never expressed their view on a given subject. It's not a coincidence, is it? That people have the same views. It's almost like I'm probably a bit guilty of this. I don't imagine I surprise you very often. That's why I like columnists like Matthew Parris. I think it makes them more valuable. It's as if they are unconfined by a kind of tribal loyalty. So I thought this was very good. The hounding of Angela Rayner is outrageous, brutal, snobbish, and completely out of proportion to any mistakes she may or may not have made. And that bracket there, or may not, is crucial, isn't it? Because even if she is found to have done something wrong, as Matthew Parris writes, the sums are tiny, and the issue itself has always been a matter of public confusion, the deeming of a property as a main residence for capital gains tax purposes. It is truly extraordinary that one of Boris Johnson's closest allies and backers is currently under investigation for a potential tax issue that has so many noughts after it that it looks like a telephone number. It actually looks bigger than a telephone number, and you're probably unaware of that, and you probably don't know his name. And I'm not even going to say it in case I've misremembered or slightly misrepresented the facts. And yet the possible failure to pay a couple of grand in capital gains tax for a house Angela Rayner bought before she was a politician continues to be on the front pages. If I were attached to the Labour Party officially, I'd be oddly torn about this, because part of me would be saying, good God, we've got them on the run. Look at this now. This makes Keir Starmer's curry look serious. This is incredible. Why do they keep advertising how desperate they are? And the client journalists who are queuing up to inflate this story, as Matthew Parris writes, regardless of whether she's done anything wrong or not, this reaction, this level of reporting is ridiculous. So we could have done smear today. We could have done smoking, smacking and smearing. And we'd have had 3 S. One day I'm going to do a show where all 3 topics can be distilled down to a single word that sounds similar to the other 2 words that the other 2 topics have been distilled down to. But sadly, today is not that day. We move from smoking to smacking while aware that PMQs is on the horizon at 12 noon. And I like this story for reasons similar to why I liked the smoking story. It's because it's an obviously good thing to do, but it's not immediately obvious how it will be done. So parents in England and Northern Ireland are currently allowed to smack their children. And parents in Wales and Scotland are not. So again, if we're going to go back to our 46-year-old hanging around outside a petrol station asking a 47-year-old to buy him 20 Bensons, this means that if you live in Berwick-upon-Tweed, you can hit your child, but if you drive 5 miles north, you can't. So if you're Scottish and you really want to hit your child, all you've got to do at the moment is drive to England, where you will be able to do it with impunity. Or will you? I don't know. If you drive back to Scotland and get reported to the authorities there, can you be prosecuted for doing something that you did in a territory where it was actually permissible and legal to do it, but you live in a territory where it's not? You see what I mean about it being a slightly odd legislative conundrum. But it is the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health who have called for this. They have described it as a scandal that Scotland and Wales had outlawed smacking, but that the other 2 home nations had not. And the evidence is not really up for debate. Smacking children does make them. Well, I mean, actually, maybe there's a little bit of debate on the causation and correlation thing here. Smacked children are much more likely to suffer poor mental health, do badly at school, and be physically assaulted or abused. I don't know how, and I might ask you this actually, I don't know how you'd prove that it is the smacking that increases that probability. Because it could be that if you're from a dysfunctional background, or you're from, or you have neglectful parents, or you have other issues, other difficulties, it could be that means you are both more likely to be smacked and more likely to suffer from poor mental health or do badly at school, or even be physically assaulted later in life or abused. Do you see what I mean? I can see the correlation, but I can't necessarily see the causation. Now, I know Berwick-on-Tweed is in England. I just said you can smack a child in Berwick-on-Tweed, Richard, but you can't a few miles north. So if you were... Anyway, if I didn't make it clear enough, that's my fault. I take full responsibility for it. I prefer Andrew's text. Andrew says, get in the car. You're going to get a smack in a few miles' time. So there is some silliness there, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the suggestion seems sound. It's described as a complete violation of children's rights. Now, I don't know about you. It will depend slightly on your age. But in fact, it takes us back to that fella in Ely a moment ago. And so I bridle when someone criticises my colleagues. You can say what you like about me, but you criticise my colleagues, and I'm a very different beast from how I am when you criticise me. And it's like family, isn't it? You can say what you want about your family, but if I criticise your family, you're going to have a bit of a beef with me. Of course you are, and vice versa. You can't criticise my family. And if I sit here now and talk about the obvious cruelty and unsuitability of smacking children, I'm criticising my family. I'm 52 years old. Almost everybody my age would have been smacked as a child. We did a quick test in the office, actually, and I was slightly surprised to discover that colleagues in their late 20s were more smacked than not smacked as well. I thought it had probably dissipated by then. I thought I would have thought, if I'd had to put a cut-up point in place, I'd have probably put 30. Something happened around that time, around 30 years ago, around 1994. Maybe it's New Labour. Maybe it's 97 is the cut-off point, actually. And it just shifted culturally from being a perfectly normal thing to do. And this is a defence of parents that did it. It was a perfectly normal thing to do. Some parents went too far, and we would all these days be fairly well qualified in identifying how far is too far. You know, cruel and unusual punishment is fairly obvious. Doing it because you've lost control, people used to say, is worse than doing it more formally. But I was never sure about that, you know. I was never sure about that. So you say something, you say something to your dad, for example, that is just outrageous, and your dad's red mist descends and he gives you a smack on the bum, and somehow that's worse than the formal. I think the formal stuff's more frightening. Certainly getting beaten at school when you have to wait outside the headmaster's study and you hear someone else being beaten and they come out with their hands in their armpits like that to try and sort of alleviate some of the pain. And then you have to go in and you have to put your hands out like that, and then you get to the end of the ritual, which is what it is, and you have to say, "Thank you, sir." That's much worse, isn't it, than someone who temporarily loses control and gives you a clatter. At least I think it is. I can't remember what I'd done, but I remember Mum telling me that I was going to get smacked when Dad got home. That was torture, man. I'd much rather Mum had just had a swing at me herself and got it out of the way. Because waiting for Dad to come home, and then thinking about it, my poor old Dad gets home, parks the Morris Marina in the drive, comes into the house, puts his briefcase down by the telephone table, and then he wants, do you know what he wants? He wants a gin and tonic and a small cigar. That's what he wants. He's had a hard day at the Daily Telegraph, writing stories about miners and car workers and the like. And he gets through the door, he's thinking, I'll just have a relax, perhaps I shall exchange some pleasantries with my charming young son, James. And he walks through the door and his wife says to him, "Oh, you've got to go upstairs and hit your son." He's going, "What? I'm just going, I want a gin and tonic and a small cigar." "No, sorry, you've got to go upstairs and hit your son first." That's weird, right? That's weirder than I say something rude and Dad's in the room and he goes, "You can't say that, thwack." But we live in a world now where none of that is acceptable, and I prefer that world. But it took me a while to get here, and it took me a while to work out why it took me a while to get here. And the reason was I don't want to slag my dead dad off. He did nothing wrong when he hit me, and yet he did. And yet he did. The people that loved us more than anyone can ever love us also hit us, because it was normal. Cultural change, eh? Mad, right? That? Absolutely no doubt whatsoever in your mind that your dad loved the bones of you. Absolutely loved the bones of you. If you're lucky enough that he's still alive, change the tense of this observation. Your dad loves you so much. In fact, you know what you could do for me today? Give him a ring and tell him how much you love him, if he's still around. And of course, if you do, some people not blessed with love in their lives or in that kind of relationship. But just take a little moment today to get in touch with your old man and tell him how much you love him. But he hit you. And if you had had some sort of truth serum, and you could have administered it to him, he would have told you that he honestly thought that it was for your own good. I'm not talking about children whose treatment would have been considered abusive even when smacking was normalised, right? I feel nothing but sympathy for you, and I appreciate there's a level of violence. So even at my prep school, I would be regularly beaten formally by the headmaster, but I've told you the story of the bonfire night where a teacher completely lost the plot and tried to kick my head in, and he got fired that night from the school. It's a mad story, that. I'll tell you the full version of it one day. And there's a difference. So there is a difference between what you would call formalised punishment or acceptable smacking and unacceptable abuse. And if you were in the latter category, I'm so sorry for you. I really am. And I hope you don't find this conversation triggering. And if you do, I'll do my best to be responsible. But for the rest of us, our parents did wrong by us. And yet they didn't. I can't unravel that. I've tried. I've got no particular beef with it historically. It's not something that came up in therapy. Being beaten by teachers came, and I didn't get smacked very often. I mean, but probably not even into double figures in my entire life. But it was there. It was there as the punishment. It was there as the ultimate sanction. And my parents could not have loved me more. So what I'm interested in, if we can do this, what I'm interested in is the damage that it does. Because I can sit here now and say to you, it didn't do me any harm. And I'm pretty sure it didn't. But I used to be, and I kid you not, I used to be adamant that being beaten by teachers at school hadn't done me any harm. I used to appear on television programmes defending corporal punishment because it hadn't done me any harm. It was a sort of self-protection mechanism. It's like a sort of suit of psychological armour. It did me loads of harm. Made me have very odd relationships with authority. It made me aggressive. It made me very, attack is the best form of defence. It made me terrified of being wrong. It made me feel shame. All of these things I carried throughout most of my adult life, from the age of 13, about the age of 10 onwards. And I'd sit in a television studio and I'd say, if it's done formally, and it's done carefully, and it's done clearly, and you know what the parameters are, and you know what you'll get beaten for, then it's actually, for some children, it's the only language they understand. And then do you know what I'd say? I'd say, and I know because I used to be one of those children. And I was so wrong. Horribly, heinously wrong. I don't think I'm wrong about my parents, but I can't say that for sure, can I? So, what do you think then? Why is smacking children, or why does smacking children make them much more likely to suffer poor mental health, to do badly at school, to be physically assaulted or even abused? Why? What damage does it do? Decent parents who did it back in the day. What talk me through it. Talk me through you or the psychology of it. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need, because most people my age, probably down to mid-30s, would have been smacked, but then having become parents, not smacked. So what's the damage done? What's the damage done? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 11:18. It is 19 minutes after 11, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I like this, and also I don't like it. Michael's been in touch to say, I can't listen, James, I have to turn off. I'm 64, and I've just started to cry as the nightmares come to the service. John in Glastonbury, just for balance, says, thank you, James. That was a really moving introduction. It made me laugh and cry. And we are going to continue with the conversation, but conscious of the reaction that Michael and a few others are having. And one very good point being made, even if we can't pinpoint precisely the harm that it does, how could it possibly do good? What possible good did it do? Who looks back and thinks, oh, thank God they smacked me. If they hadn't smacked me, I'd be in all sorts of bother. The research seems to suggest that if they smacked you, you are more likely to get into all sorts of bother later in life, although there's a little quibble there between correlation and causation. Paul puts it best. Let's suppose for a second that it doesn't do any harm. What good could it possibly do? Does it force compliance through violence? I would never act grateful for corporal punishment at school. I think, and I'm not getting my violin out or asking you to feel sorry for me, but I think if you didn't say thank you on the way out of the headmaster's study, you'd get another whack. I think that's why we all said thank you. We didn't make some sort of rebellious stand. So I'm not. You don't say thank you. He calls you back for more. So what is the damage that is done? I don't doubt it, to be clear, but I want some help articulating. I don't doubt it, but I can't describe it. Claire's in Wimbledon. Claire, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I think it just starts with a really sad thing that if you want your children to be respectful, therefore you have to give them respect. Say, for example, if you were a person at work and you did something bad and you got pulled into the your boss's office and he went, you've done this, this and this, and then cracked you across the face, you should be absolutely shocked and worried, wouldn't you? Same thing works with children. The way you treat them, how you wish them to grow up. Therefore, if you do this thing where you smack and degrade them, it starts a cycle of events. Therefore,
I think you've already crossed the line, and this might be me speaking as a child of the 70s who adores his parents and whose parents adored him, because I'm already feeling defensive, and I'm trying to draw a really important distinction between smacking a child on the bottom or on the legs for being naughty. I don't see that, and I could be wrong here, but I don't see that in the same universe as punching a colleague in the face because they've annoyed me at work. Maybe I should do.
Oh, no, I didn't mean like punching. I meant I just gave you like a smack. Like, you'd be like shocked, wouldn't you? You'd be like, ooh, what have I done?
Yeah, but I don't see it as being the same. I don't know why. I mean, it was normal growing up for parents to physically discipline their children. It's not normal for bosses to physically discipline their staff. So it's just a question of what's normal now.
I think what you have to understand is, as a child, you're growing up and you are the one that are teaching them self-awareness. You are the one that is teaching them how to be.
I do.
I mean, I was smacked. I was smacked as a child.
So how did it harm you?
Well, I suppose it didn't.
Well, that's the point I'm making. You're here to tell me that it did.
It put the actual fear of God in me. You know, it was like the joke with my brother. Like, if we had the choice of the police catching us or my mum and dad catching us, we'd rather the police got us before our mum and dad. So it put the actual fear of granny into us, if you know what I mean. But however, I've got children and I have never smacked them.
No, I know that, but I'm trying to pin down the harm that it did, and you like me don't think it did you any harm, and yet
I don't think it did me any harm. But I can understand now, in this day and age, with so much going on, where kids need that kind of, not stability, that safe net, that kind of.
I can as well. I can as well. And the world has changed. The world has turned. But we need to. I think we're possibly look. We're either both right or both wrong. And I'm interested in entertaining the possibility that it hasn't done us deep and lasting harm, but it might have done us some harm, because the rationale for banning it is that it is bad on every level. So even if you've got this sort of 1970s hangover of not wanting to put the boot into your own parents because A, they were doing something that everybody did, and B, they loved you, they were not abusive parents, we have to entertain the possibility that even for children like us, lasting harm was done. Neil is in Weston-super-Mare. Neil, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
We've spoken before about social care and things in the past. And I run a social care company. I deliver training on behaviour management in children and adults.
Yes.
And one of the things that we know about children that were smacked, I was smacked as a child, and I had loving parents and everything. And they just did what everyone did in the 80s. And before that, but what we know about children when they're children that are smacked is that it increases the cortisone levels and increases the expectation of fear or the expectation of abuse from future relationships as an adult.
And this is chemistry that you're describing. This isn't sociology this is basic biology.
This is provable fact. And the other thing that we should consider is, whenever you ask anybody that still condones smacking in children, you say, so what are you actually trying to achieve by smacking your child? Well, I'm trying to punish him and tell him that he shouldn't do that. I said, so you're trying to educate your child. But you're not educating your child, because there's no link between smacking a child and actually what they actually did, if draw on a wall or whatever, running into a road, whatever the child did. There's no link between those two. So the child's not going to understand what they did wrong. We need to educate your child. So you need to stop them, tell them that you love them, afterwards, because it's about repairing that relationship. But you need to actually help that child understand what he should do differently.
I think you're obviously right. How do you spot the damage? How do you know what's possibly being caused by being smacked as a child. It's funny how I use the word beaten when I talk about school. Well, it's not funny at all, because I was beaten at school. It was a very different thing. I was smacked at home occasionally, beaten at school quite regularly. They were two very, very different things, and I find it easy to identify the lasting damage done by the beatings at school. But how would you, a child smacked in a non-abusive stroke criminal way is going to suffer? What would be the signs of that, the impact of that experience?
What's interesting is that most of the people that still condone, that I speak to, that still condone it when I'm delivering training and things, are quite often men. And one of the things that's quite a familiar factor in those men is the fact that they will want to be men that quite often don't show their emotions. Two, because they're quite often told things like, don't cry, don't be a girl. They're quite often they're men that go, well, I'll just take the pain myself. I'll just take it on myself, rather than actually sharing and explaining why they might be in pain, in which relates to early suicide, increased suicide rates in men, specifically, and why there is a poor mental health. It's all related to, increased violence.
And also what you consider to be an acceptable way for you to be treated. So subconsciously, that's I deserve it.
Attachment.
I deserve
it. So your expectations in relationships actually become one of what is self-neglect or abuse.
So that would make sense. So it doesn't mean that everyone whose dad smacked them on the bottom for nicking a pound note out of their mum's purse to go down the arcade with Dale from number 53 doesn't mean that everyone in that category carries any of the things that you describe. But in order to protect the people that do, the future people that do, we outlaw it completely.
Completely. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, it is.
It's an absolute no-brainer, because it's not punishing a child; it's abusing a child.
Yeah, and that's now I feel defensive again, because my dad didn't abuse me.
No, because they didn't. It didn't intentionally, but there is. I mean, I feel the same thing, because I had an absolutely incredible father. He passed away a few years ago, and I had an amazing relationship with him. And he taught me very much about. In his own way, about how I should be as a person. But he didn't do that intentionally. That was just purely him as a person. But he smacked. I didn't get smacked a lot.
No, same.
And I definitely pushed a lot of boundaries when I was younger.
See, you're coming close to saying you deserved it, then, weren't you? Just subconsciously, because you love your dad, and we're complicated creatures. We're not flipping robots.
Absolutely.
But you didn't deserve it. You never deserved it. And I never deserved it. Didn't. But they didn't do bad when they did it.
No,
intentionally.
Absolutely.
I'll take the intentionally.
And there have been times where I've been pushed to my levels with our 4-year-old son, because
of course.
Younger, and things get complicated, where I've been close to doing it, and then it just you shock yourself out of it, and that's ridiculous. That's absolutely silly. And afterwards, and then that's the important part of apologising and repairing that relationship.
Yeah. And of course, the big takeaway from everything you've said is the importance of talking, articulating, not repressing, not holding it in. I don't think we'll be doing it today, because I've framed the question very differently. But in the past, when we've taken calls from men, almost always men, who were still defending their right to hit children, that I think you'd let me say that there was you could detect a certain type. I don't know that I would go much further than that, but a certain type, and that wasn't true in the 70s and 80s, because it was so utterly commonplace. 11:30 is the time. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 11:32 is the time. PMQ's on the way, of course, around about 12. Natasha Clark, our political editor, joining me shortly before kick-off to run her eye over the likely contents of PMQs. Although, I mean, it's all up for grabs today. The rebellion on the smoker? I don't know. I won't preempt it. We shall wait for Natasha. In the meantime, the question of why smacking must be banned everywhere. Currently banned. Parental smacking, currently banned in Wales and Scotland, but not banned in England and Northern Ireland. It's funny. The devolution's very odd. I'm turning into that character from the Fast Show. Have you noticed? I'm trying so hard not to say the word extraordinary that I'm turning into that Paul Whitehouse character who thinks everything's amazing. I'm calling everything mad and bonkers. It's mad, isn't it? It's amazing. But devolution's bonkers, isn't it? Devolution, it's incredible. Because the things that they can do and the things that they can't do. So, you've got UK-wide laws, regulations in various areas, but on something like smacking, you can have a complete difference, a complete disconnect. Literally, one step from Wales into England, and the law changes on smacking your own children. It's because you drive over the Severn Bridge. Would it happen there? Would you move in the course of that one expanse? That one road over the bridge, I think is the border on the pretty much on the bridge. I just remember telling my kid sister that we needed passports to get in and out of Wales. We're going to Wales on holiday. We're going to Abbot on Wales, and I said, "I've got my passport. Have you got yours?" And she got all upset. I don't think I got smacked for that. That was a very low level bit of bad brothering. 11:34 is the time, but we're talking about why it's necessary, and I know a lot of people are ringing me and sharing stories of really unacceptable and gross treatment from their parents. And although we're not taking those calls today, I don't want you to think that I am, or we are, ignoring you or unsympathetic. It's just that in terms of solving this mystery, as how does the damage manifest itself, today's conversation is about parents who were not bang out of order. So Stavros, whose dad took a belt to him, that's just disgusting and unforgivable. And even at the time, most people would have considered that wrong. But what we're talking about today is the smacking that at the time most people considered fine. That's all. So I'm sorry. It must be tough to ring in, and then even tougher to realise that you're not going to get on the programme. I just want you to know that you're in my thoughts. But that today's conversation is about the smacking that everyone thought was okay. And the smacking that you received, the abuse that you received, was not okay. And it certainly was not your fault, but it was not okay. It's the social change with the stuff that was acceptable and how we would articulate the damage that stuff did. Jane's in Portsmouth. Jane, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I wanted to have a crack at answering your question about what harm did it do. Yeah. So I'm 45. I grew up in, I really resonate with you describing your family as, I was loved. My parents loved me. I was never in any doubt. I think I fall into that category of someone that was smacked occasionally, but I think in that kind of acceptable at the time way.
Yes.
Only sort of further on into my life did I then go through a separation from a marriage that I now realise was a very unpleasant marriage, and there was pushing and shoving that I experienced in that, and I entered therapy, and during the process of that therapy I discovered that actually it had caused me some harm. The smacking that I'd thought had never caused me any harm. I'd chosen not to smack my own children, and I explored the reasons around why I'd made that decision. And interestingly, I ended up having a really casual conversation with my sibling, my only sibling. We were brought up I'm 6 years older. It was a different time for my parent when we're half siblings. So my mother was in a different situation and in a much sort of a more loving relationship, and we were parented differently in that respect. And we had a conversation, as siblings do, about it's funny how we tend to parent differently, isn't it? We make different decisions about our own kids, to how other generations have done. And I said, for instance, I was smacked as a child now and then to be disciplined, and I've chosen not to do that with my children. My sister said, I wasn't smacked, and the conversation went along those lines. I swear it was different times, and the conversation ended. Fast forward 18 months, I'm now completely estranged from my mum, my stepdad and my sister, because the fallout of that was that my sister shared that conversation with my parents, and the engine that moved into motion was complete and utter denial about the way I was parented.
Right.
Even though it was a very casual conversation of small statement of fact, but the ability to acknowledge and discuss and talk about and explore was absolutely shut down, to the point where I was told, we've checked with other members of our family and they've all confirmed that you were never smacked either.
Gosh.
Your memories are wrong. And I come from a very, very loving, close, nurturing family. I have very happy memories of my childhood. And yet I'm in a situation now where the bond between my parent and I is completely gone because of a lack of desire to discuss it.
So were you raised by your stepfather?
Yeah.
You were, and it was him who smacked you.
No, it was actually my mother.
It was your mum who smacked you.
Very occasional, yeah, and it was the sort of stuff that you described.
And you weren't offering it up as a poor me and yet you're.
No, it was we do things differently, don't we? Isn't it interesting? And actually, to answer your question, what harm did it do? Yeah. I've always, like you, it didn't do me any harm. Yeah. I'm all right. And through therapy, I think I realised actually, and through this experience of becoming estranged because I've wanted to talk about things that people are finding difficult to hear, I think I've realised that the harm it's done is that I don't have enough of a bond with that parent to be able to weather difficult discussions like this. And I think that is the harm.
I wonder why, because, that's unlucky on one level, because there's plenty of people listening from our generation who do have that relationship with their parents and were also smacked in the way that you were. So it's not an objective algorithm, is it? We're humans and we're complicated, and that's also tough on you. That's almost gaslighting, isn't it? To be told that this thing happened didn't happen.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a shocker to realise that actually the bonds that you have, potentially looking at the research. I'm a healthcare professional and I work with families at the very start of their lives with their babies, and it's very interesting to me to look at the research and the evidence that talks to us about the damage to bonds and. It's all there, it's all in front of us. And yet I'd never even contemplated that it had caused any harm. I only mentioned it as a kind of, oh, look, it's a difference that I've chosen, I've chosen to do something different with my children. And yet here I am.
There was something deeper than that. There was something deeper than that. Your experience is not common, obviously, with the denial from your mum and your stepfather, but the knowledge that something had obviously gone a little deeper than you acknowledged or wanted to acknowledge, that will be shared by an awful lot of people. If any of this is affecting you and you want to talk to somebody, then NAPAC is a wonderful organisation, the National Association for People Abused in Childhood. You can look them up online or give them a ring on 0808 801 0331. Various ways to get in touch. And they're not like the Samaritans. They're not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're closed at weekends and stuff like that. But on a normal weekday, they're open 10 till 9, 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. and they finish at 6 p.m. on Friday. So just a quick heads up there for people who are being a bit triggered. Dan, a very mild example of that. I don't think triggered would be quite the right word, but he's been in touch to say this caller is really making me realise how this may have affected me far more than I ever appreciated. I loved both my parents, barely got smacked at all, but we would never consider hitting our 4-year-old daughter as a punishment, and I feel terribly guilty if I ever even find myself coming close. I too thought I was a little sod as a kid and deserved it. And I'm talking about me now, we are almost the same age. That idea that you deserved it, that's it, isn't it? We got there. So even if you're fine and you're not carrying any obvious baggage as a consequence of what was acceptable smacking, the fact that you would have thought you deserved it, that may be something that has harmed you moving forward. Not for the first time. Emma provides a really powerful counterpoint to that, saying it's normal but not right. Smacking at home is on the continuum. You can't trust your parents. The consequence of it is that you can't trust your parents to not hurt you, possibly even based on broken rules that you didn't even know were rules. I can remember every time I was smacked at home, sometimes right across the face, I can still feel the impotent rage it invoked in me, the sense of injustice and powerlessness. I only need to close my eyes and think for a second. I can conjure it up again. That poisonous emotion is still in my body 30 years later. It resides in me solely because my beloved parents, and that beloved is straight, it's not sarky or anything. My beloved parents induced it in me. And that is not what parents are supposed to instill in their kids. And they go on. So perhaps passing on that rage is how smacking perpetuates itself generationally. You put that impotent rage in someone small, and it becomes an instinct to lash out when you become big, when induced in an adult. Keith is in Willesden Green. Keith, what made you pick up the phone?
Morning, James.
Hello,
you well? For me, I think this resonates a lot. As I grew up going into adult relationships, I basically found that I had no conflict resolution skills whatsoever. I would always immediately go in aggressive and not give the other person an opportunity to use their voice. And it caused a lot of issues. I've been married for 5 years, but with my partner for 12 years now. And early in our relationship, it caused a lot of issues. I was never physical, but just the willingness to react in an aggressive way. I never really understood where it came from. And it was only through getting a course of therapy that actually, I'd seen quite a few therapists throughout my life, but this guy really unlocked me. And he basically said that I was never taught to discuss things. It was always a punishment if there was some sort of disagreement. And I think I grew up as one of the people thinking, oh, it's okay to smack your kids, you know, it's not a big issue. And it was a disagreement I actually had with my wife early in our relationship. And the interesting thing is she came from a home where that was never a thing. And I guess it's the old hurt people sort of
how did the therapist draw the line? Well, of course you did the work. So how did you draw the line back to that? Because it you know, could have ended up perhaps in that fight or flight mode, in that living your life. I've always described it as living your life with your metaphorical fists up. So you're not capable of conflict resolution because you're too busy trying to make sure that you close the conversation down, close the argument down, remove any possibility of shame or embarrassment by humiliating or defeating rhetorically the other person. How did you trace it back to being smacked? How did you draw the line?
There was one particular sort of, not event, it was sort of like a weekly event. I was in primary school at the time, and I had a teacher that literally hated me. They taught my brother, who was 2 years older than me, but I went into their class and there was just a bad relationship from the beginning. And it became a thing where every week my parents would sort of go and see them at the end of the school week, have a chat with her, and she would tell them so many things that I hadn't done and paint me out to be an awful sort of child. And when we got home, there was never any opportunity for my parents, or my parents never gave me the opportunity to explain and say, well, no, that's not true. That's not the true series of events. It was just straight to sort of getting a whack.
So that's and then, rage, isn't it? So you're buried. You knew you didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
You knew you didn't deserve it. And that festers inside you.
Yeah. And the frustrating thing is now, I'm 36. You know, I spoke to my parents about that particular teacher a couple of years ago, and I can remember my mum saying, "Oh yeah, she never liked you. She never liked you." And I was just thinking, "Oh come on,
you're supposed to look after me."
Yeah. There was nobody sort of fighting my corner in that way, but it meant that as I grew older, I just thought, right. And it was only in close relationships. I'd never be like it to Joe Bloggs out on the street, because I never witnessed my parents being like it to Joe Bloggs out on the street. It was only at home with me and my brother. And it just seemed to be, okay, well, this is how we communicate our frustration with each other. This is, instead of using words. And there was never an explanation afterwards. There was never a sit down like, this is why that happened. This is why we were disappointed, upset, why, you know, here is where we feel you could have improved your behaviour or anything. It was almost like, whack, done.
Fascinating. I mean, your age is fascinating as well, because you're right on the cusp, I would say, between the generations for whom it was completely normal and the generations for whom it's completely unacceptable. You know, at 36, you're almost smack in the middle of it. And I presume doing the work, it's you now that looks after little Keith. It's big Keith that puts the metaphorical arm around him and tells him that he's safe now.
Yeah, absolutely that. And it's sort of,
Gets me every time, every single time. Since I had it in therapy, I must have mentioned it on the radio a dozen times. Every single time it gets me right in the feels.
Yeah, and I think you look to your parents as protectors, and they're the people that when an outside person sort of comes on the attack to you, or you feel like you've been mistreated, you would assume they would be the ones to stand up and say, hold on a minute. But, you know, in those moments, it felt the opposite. It felt like they'd switched sides. And, I think it just made me grow up with my therapist always said spikes out armour. I was always very spikes out. But I would only ever put that armour on when I was in my own home, because those are the relationships that I witnessed being aggressive, and where when people were frustrated, that's how you took it out on them. And
that's really interesting, because I took my spikes to work. I mean, anyone who listened to this program 20 years ago will tell you that. And I still sometimes, none of us are perfect, still sometimes they pop out as well, but that's because it was school. It was a public place for me where this stuff happened. The smacking at home didn't really register in that way. And oddly, listening to you, my mum and dad sided with me against the teachers when things got really bad, which, looking back, was a very rare thing to do at the time, because you would, in that era, you would almost act as one. Keith, I love that, mate, and I'm so glad you've done the work. I'm so glad you've got to that space. Anyone who hasn't had therapy and is sort of listening to this, thinking, I didn't realise it's a sort of, things that blokes do or that kind of thing. The single most important moment in these conversations that you have with the therapist is the moment when you realise that you, as an adult, can look after that child, because that child's still alive. I mean, this isn't exactly rocket science. That child is still alive. That child is you. But the child is still inside you somewhere, and the child is still not being looked after. The child is still spikes out, ready for a fight, and you can change it. You can change it by looking after the child. Big you can look after little you, regardless of what it was that traumatized you or did the damage that was done. It can be undone, and when it happens, when it works, it's almost magical. Keith, take care. It's 10 to 12. It is 11:53, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to contemplate the impacts, often unseen, unacknowledged, and don't want to acknowledge, of being smacked as a child. Because the call today from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health is for England and Northern Ireland to catch up, if you like, with Scotland and Wales and outlaw it completely. And what's not to like? A little nod back to the first hour, because the ruling is going to be very hard to implement. What we once considered acceptable, that sort of smacking, how are you going to prosecute it? But equally, how are you going to stop a 46-year-old 20 years, 30 years hence from asking a 47-year-old to buy them 20 Marlboro Lights? So it doesn't have to be, watertight legislatively to be desirable socially or politically. 11:54 is the time. That organisation that I mentioned earlier, a few of you are asking about, supporting recovery from childhood abuse is the job of NAPAC, NAPAC, the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, and the number 0808 801 0331. But if you just Google NAPAC, NAPAC, you'll find everything that you need to find. 11:55 is the time. PMQ's on the way. Time for one or two more calls before that. Lara is in Nottingham. Lara, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning,
Hello.
James. I was smacked as a kid. I mean, I was a nightmare of a child, I have to say. An absolute nightmare.
You see, straight away.
Yes, just hear me out.
I am hearing you out.
Okay, and I have no doubt in my mind that my mum loved me. It was my mum. My dad never, ever, laid a finger on us. He just gave us the look, and that's it. I would die in shame. But my mum was very, very much, not to the extent that it would harm us physically, no bruises or anything of the sort.
Yes.
But it was repeatedly done. And then, like I said, I mean, I never doubted her love to me. I still don't doubt her love to me. And I wouldn't class it as abuse either.
Okay.
However, fast forward 20 years later, I'm in a relationship in my marriage, and I was physically abused, and that I would call abuse. And in my mind, I thought, yes, well, I deserved it because I was naughty, I was bad. And it went on and on and on for about 9 years. And in a way, I never saw the link, but being hit as a kid or being smacked as a kid and then being told that I love you made it okay for me to accept his I love you.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what you've been through, but the clarity of what you've just explained is stunning. Absolutely stunning.
But again, I cannot say my mother abused me.
No, of course, I don't want you to. But I tell you what I do want you to say. I want you to say that you were a lovely child and that you didn't deserve to be here.
I don't know.
Yes, you were. You were absolutely lovely.
I had character.
You were lovely. We were both lovely. We were both lovely children. And neither of us ever deserved... But there it is.
I wasn't able to confront him. I wasn't able to say, this is wrong. What you're doing to me is wrong. And I've accepted it back then.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, I did work on myself and I did go to therapy. And if anything, now I'm a bit more confrontational. And if something is not right, I would stand up and say it. It will be it for me, for anybody around me, even a stranger on the street. I would stand and fight for them if I find that there's something wrong.
Yes.
But it, yeah.
But the parameters of what is acceptable were drawn long before you met your abusive husband.
Yes.
I think.
Yes. As long as you say, I love you, and you give me a hug at the end.
And everything, because your mum did.
It's okay.
Oh, God, Laura, thank you. You've taken us right up to the end of this conversation in a really powerful way, and I'm so glad that you're in a much better place now. And I'm so glad that you told me off for interrupting you earlier, otherwise we wouldn't have got there in the time available. So it's all there, all covered. 11:58 is the time. It is that time of... How many have we had? Two weeks off, Natasha Clark?
I think it's been 3.
3 weeks off. From PMQs, they will pick up, I presume, where they left off.
What, squabbling like teenagers?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sure they will. Sure, we can play bingo. Is it going to be back to square one? Who's going to mention Liz Truss first? All of the usual, I'm sure, phrases will come out of the woodwork again. I agreed with what you said earlier, that I think he will go on smoking.
And you needed us to get your big idea over the line, sort of thing.
Oh, as in, of course. But also it gives Keir Starmer the argument to talk about how the Tories are such a divided party, and he loves talking about that. So I imagine that might be one, especially if Kemi Badenoch, I can't see her at the moment whether she is sitting on the front bench, but it might be something to point out. It was a free vote,
to be clear.
Of course it was, but it was, a mess.
But it's still embarrassing.
It's a mess of their own making. They didn't need to make it a free vote, and he knew that it would have exposed the divisions in his own party by allowing MPs to vote however they liked. And you've even got Kemi Badenoch that feels so strongly against it that she actually voted against the whole thing. Penny Mordaunt, I can see she's on the front bench. She abstained on it, and she, again, is seen by many as a potential Tory leadership candidate, and lots of these people thinking, well, actually, we need to be on the right side of the grassroots Conservatives, ready for when that comes.
It's a crucial point, because it is the only caucus identified by pollsters as being broadly opposed to this legislation is Conservative members, not voters.
Not voters.
Conservative voters are warmer towards it than Labour voters, only by a 2-point difference. 62% of Conservative voters like it, 60% of Labour voters like it, but Conservative members, a majority, don't like it. So they're all watching that particular ball, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. It is generally really, obviously we've had lots of callers on both sides of the equation that have been calling into the station about this, but generally I think from the minute it was announced at Tory conference, there was a lot of warm words for this policy. And like you say, all the polls do suggest that people do like it. I think the question that many Tory MPs they were asking, is it really going to make you vote for the Conservatives at the upcoming election? And as one person put it to me yesterday, there's nothing the Tories can offer to me that's going to make me vote for them at the next election. But I don't think that banning smoking is going to be something that will get them over the line.
Unlikely. Is any of the Suella Braverman's association with this strange ragtag of right-wing weirdos who, for the record, should still be able to exercise freedom of speech, whether they're in Brussels, Bolton or Birmingham, but a bit odd for a Conservative MP to be on a platform with some distinctly strange opinions. Will he bring that up, Starmer?
Well, Starmer may do, but Rishi Sunak, I think, will come out in favour of free speech on this. His spokesperson yesterday said that he was worried about what happened in Brussels and what appeared to be the case, that they had blocked this meeting from taking place. Indeed, that tweet from the Foreign Minister of Brussels said, "We don't welcome the far right in Brussels." And I think it's turned into a political issue, political football. And arguably the Brussels Foreign Minister and the Mayor has walked right into that trap of essentially cancelling this gathering, giving them even more fuel to their fire. So maybe they will raise that.
The one thing you shouldn't do with desperate attention seekers is give the attention that they seek.
Throw them some more petrol on that fire.
Here's Keir Starmer.
Can I too welcome the postmasters in the gallery in their quest for justice. And Mr. Speaker, this week we marked 35 years since the disaster at Hillsborough. And the enduring courage and determination of the families must be marked by the passing of a Hillsborough law. Mr. Speaker, we also lost Lord Richard Rosser, a lifelong member of the Labour Party. He will be greatly missed, and our thoughts are with his wife Sheena, his family and friends. Mr. Speaker, I'm privileged to be the proud owner of a copy of the former Prime Minister's new book. It's a rare, unsigned copy. It's the only unsigned copy. It's quite the read. She claims the Tory party's disastrous kamikaze budget that triggered chaos for millions was, her words, the happiest moment of her premiership. Has the Prime Minister met anyone with a mortgage who agrees?
Well, Mr. Speaker, all I'd say is he ought to spend a bit less time reading that book and a bit more time reading the Deputy Leader's tax advice.
I think we'll have less talking. I want to get through PMQs. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we've got a billionaire Prime Minister and a billionaire Prime Minister, both of whose families have used schemes to avoid millions of pounds of tax, smearing a working class woman. And the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, has a long list of people to blame for the economic misery. They don't want to hear it. They made her Prime Minister, and millions of people are paying the price. She's got a long list of people to blame. She blames the Governor of the Bank of England, the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility. The American President is blamed at one point. We even learned that the poor old lettuce was part of the deep state. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's actually much simpler than that? It was the Tories' unfunded tax cuts, tens of billions of pounds of unfunded tax cut, that crashed the economy and left millions paying more on their mortgages, wasn't it?
Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that 2 years ago I wasn't afraid to repeatedly warn about what her economic policies would lead to, even if it wasn't what people wanted to hear at the time. Mr. Speaker, I was right then, but I'm also right now when I say that his economic policies would be a disaster for Britain. He would send inflation up, mortgages up, and taxes up, and working people would pay the price.
Well, I appreciate the Prime Minister having the stomach to say it out loud, but everyone knows it's the Tory party's obsession with wild, unfunded tax cut that crashed the economy. We know it, he knows it, they know it, and the whole country is living it. So when is he finally going to learn the lesson from his predecessor's mistakes and explain where the money is coming from for his own completely unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance?
Mr. Speaker, when my predecessor was running for leader, to use his words, I did have the stomach to argue out loud about her economic policies, had the conviction to say that they were wrong. But not once, but twice, he tried to make his predecessor Prime Minister. Despite him opposing NATO and Trident, ignoring anti-Semitism and siding with our enemies. It's clear what he did. He put his own interests ahead of Britain's.
I think actually when he was running for Prime Minister, for leader, he was explaining how he's funneling money from poor areas to pay it into richer areas. We know what his record is. I notice he's not denying the £46 billion promise to scrap the national insurance, but he's refusing to say where the money will come from. And we've been trying for months to get to the bottom of this. So now's his chance. No more spin, no more waffle, no more diversion. I know that'll be difficult. He can either, Mr. Speaker, this is the choice, he can either cut state pension or the NHS that national insurance funds, that's route one, or he can put up income tax. Which one is it?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've just cut taxes by £900 for a typical worker. We've delivered the biggest tax cut for businesses since the 1980s. But while we're cutting taxes, Labour is already putting them up. In Wales, putting up taxes right now for small businesses. In Birmingham, putting up council tax by 21%. And in London, his mayor has put up taxes by 70%, Mr. Speaker. And this is just a glimpse of what they'd do if they got in power. A few weeks ago, he finally admitted it to The Sun. What would he say he would do? I quote, he said, "We would put up taxes." It's always the same, Mr. Speaker. Higher taxes and working people paying the price.
No single politician has ever put tax up more times than he has. But Mr. Speaker, just hang on, because he was given the chance. He was just given the chance to rule out cutting the NHS or state pensions to pay for scrapping national insurance. No, I was a lawyer long enough to know when someone's avoiding the question. So I'm going to give him another chance. Will he now rule out cuts the NHS, cuts the state pension, or putting up taxes to pay for his unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance? Which is it?
Mr. Speaker, I make absolutely no apology about wanting to end the unfairness of the double taxation on work, Mr. Speaker. The NHS is receiving record funding under this Conservative government. Pensioners have just received a £900 increase under this government. But if he wants to talk about tax, let's have a look at what Labour's brand newly appointed tax advisor has to say. This advisor thinks that supporting pensioners is a complete disgrace, Mr. Speaker. He believes their free TV licences are ridiculous. And if it wasn't bad enough, this advisor has called for increases in income tax, in national insurance and VAT. It all makes sense now. That's who the Shadow Chancellor's been copying and pasting from.
So this is genuinely extraordinary. Two chances to rule out, Mr. Speaker, two chances to rule out cuts to state pension, cuts to the NHS, or income tax rises to fund his promise to abolish national insurance.
Order. Mr. Hull, I want you to set a good example, not a bad one. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, this really matters. He's had two chances to rule out these cuts to NHS, cuts to tax or pensions or tax rise. This matters to millions of people watching who want to know what's going to happen to their NHS and pensions. It really does matter to millions of people who are watching. So I'll be really generous now and give him one last chance. Very simple, very clear. Is his £46 billion promise to abolish national insurance being paid for by cuts to the NHS, cuts to the state pension, or yet another Tory tax rise?
Mr. Speaker, he's really got to keep up, Mr. Speaker. Right? It's this government that's just delivered a £900 increase to the state pension. It's this government that's already committed to the triple lock for the next Parliament. He had 6 opportunities. I didn't think I heard him say that, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to the NHS, you'd much rather be treated in Conservative-run NHS in England, not the Labour-run NHS in Wales, Mr. Speaker. But it's another week where all we heard is political sniping, Mr. Speaker, not a word about their plans for the country. He's failed to acknowledge that since we last met, taxes have been cut by £900, state pensions gone up, free childcare has been expanded, wages have risen for 9 months in a row, Mr. Speaker, and just today, inflation down again to 3.2%. Our plan is working and the Conservatives are delivering a brighter future for Britain.
Mr. Speaker, you will not be surprised to learn that I very much welcome the £20 million allocated to Carlton in my Gedling constituency as part of the long-term plan for towns. But I'm very eager to see that this money is spent according to local wishes. I know there'll be consultations following the setting up of the Towns Board, so will my right honourable friend join me in urging Carlton residents to take part in those forthcoming consultations, to make sure their voices are heard and to ensure that this money is spent where the people want?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his tireless campaigning on behalf of the residents of Carlton. Our long-term plan for towns means that 75 towns across the country, including Carlton, will benefit from £20 million each to invest in their local area. But crucially, as he said, that will be in the hands of local people deciding on their priorities for the place that we live, whether it's regenerating local high streets, investing in parks and green spaces, or tackling antisocial behaviour. We're levelling up across the country, and he deserves enormous praise for his role in securing that investment.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, a former Prime Minister who oversaw a financial crash before being unceremoniously turfed from office told the public the truth, and I'm not referring to that one, Mr. Speaker, because on Monday, Gordon Brown told the people of these Isles that the forces pulling Britain apart are greater than the forces holding it together. So maybe the Prime Minister can find some time this afternoon to perhaps agree with just one of his predecessors.
Well, Mr. Speaker, where I do agree with my predecessor very strongly is that Scotland would be far stronger inside the United Kingdom.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, of course, where Gordon Brown was also correct was in stating that Scottish independence is not simply off the agenda. And indeed, those remarks were echoed just yesterday by the General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, who stated that it remains an unresolved issue, Mr. Speaker, before going on to state, and I confirm, and they may laugh at her, but she said, that can be a very dangerous place to end up in when you are not allowing people to express their wishes in a democratic manner. So may I ask the Prime Minister, does he welcome the fulsome, wholehearted and warm support of the Labour Party in denying the people of Scotland that opportunity to have a say over their own future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we did have a democratic vote on that topic, but what I would suggest to the SNP is that rather than obsessing about independence and indeed wasting time cracking down on free speech and trying to lock up J.K. Rowling, he should focus on what the people of Scotland actually care about: schools, hospitals, jobs and our new tax cuts.
Name Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I abhor a two-tier policing system, and we must ensure that everyone's treated equally under the rule of law. The Labour Police and Crime Commissioner who investigated the Beergate scandal handed their police chief constable a new 3-year contract, whilst the investigation...
12:15 is the time. I don't think there's anybody in the world currently thinking, I'd like to hear what Andrea Jenkins has to say. So, working on that premise.
This is LBC.
12:16 is the time. Some random texts before we pick over the bones of what you have just heard. Tony says Lindsay Hoyle seems to have given up his current role as Speaker. Andrew says Stephen Flynn, brilliant again. Di says, why is Sunak so incapable of answering a question? Caroline asks a question I see every week, Why does PMQs have to be like this, James? Why can't they just talk to each other in a normal way rather than continually sneery tone with all the weird jeering noises in the background? I think that was Jonathan Gullis, actually, the weird jeering noises in the background. Chris points out, sigh, he writes, PMQs, and Sunak pressed the Corbyn button again. Tony says, what is Starmer playing at with these questions? He's making Sunak sound competent. Colin says, what an absolute waste of time that was. Just call an election already. And James says, since when did Keir Starmer become a comedian? That was cracking. As was her joke about give her one of my speeches in a children's hospital show on Have I Got News for You. You've met him, James. Has he had lessons or is this just him? Something you've picked up on in the relatively recent past, Natasha Clark.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, haven't we, James?
Keir Starmer has discovered his funny bones.
He is. They were. I enjoyed both the opening remarks from him. Has he read it? I've got the only unsigned copy. Lovely.
A bit close to home, that, actually. That's a joke.
Yeah, exactly. Is there any copies in your book that are unsigned? Do they exist?
Not unsigned. No, not
yet. I'll pay you a tenner if I can find one of those in any bookshops. But yes, and I actually, to be fair, also thought that Rishi Sunak's retort obviously fired up the Tory benches, but also was quite funny as he spent a bit more time reading the Deputy Leader's tax advice. I thought that was quite funny. Again, it's clear after a couple of weeks off that everybody is a bit more fired up. I think we were a bit flat at the end of last term, weren't we? And everybody really needed a break. And now both of them, I think, have had their Weetabix again. But yes, Keir Starmer is absolutely enjoying being leader of the opposition and doing these Prime Minister's questions even more. And you can sort of see it and you hear it with the media interviews that many of them do from the front bench. They are very much, I think, expecting to win the next election now. There is obviously a risk that some of them do get a little bit arrogant about the whole thing, but I think that generally it comes across with Keir as more confident and I think a bit more statesman-like, but equally also a little bit more humanity. And Keir Starmer, I think, struggles to show that humanity sometimes, and when he is making some of these funny jokes, it is a little bit more of his human side. So I think it does work in this kind of setting.
And yet there wasn't much there. Did that work, that attempt to pin down, to make him make a pledge? That's a pre-election ploy. He's quite good at this, but it doesn't work well in the moment. We saw him setting a trap for Boris Johnson, which Boris Johnson ended up essentially being enmeshed in, although it wasn't technically what did for him in the end, the claims about parties at Downing Street and the rest of it. This is attempting to triangulate Sunak into a position where his election pledges would contradict something that Starmer had got him to say in Parliament about where the money was going to come from, I think, or something like that.
Yes, so he was trying to get him to say this. So Rishi Sunak has repeatedly said he wants to abolish national insurance completely. The Conservatives have not said where the money to pay for that is going to come from. Labour have rightly jumped on this issue because that's something that the Conservatives love to attack them about. It's one for them to poke a hole in. But yes, Rishi Sunak hasn't said what he'll do to fund it. He said it's a long-term ambition, but it is going to cost a lot of money if he's going to do it, £46 billion. And yes, so that was Keir Starmer trying to say, would you like to cut the NHS to pay for it? Would you like to cut pensions to pay for it? Or would you like to put taxes?
Because it will have to come from somewhere.
It's going to have to come from somewhere, of course.
And it will have to be one of those three things.
It doesn't have to be. Could be anything.
Probably, though. I mean, if you're looking at the figures involved.
Yes, but he has said he wants to do it over a long time, and I imagine they won't need the money immediately to do so, and it will be something that they can do over a long period of time. They're obviously cutting it by just a percentage point each time, so it doesn't take too much to do so.
Maybe.
However, I think that it does resonate with voters as well. You've said you want to cut national insurance, and how are you going to pay for it? That's a lot. You get that a lot during election campaigns, especially when parties make unfunded promises. Keir Starmer's Labour Party are not going to make that mistake again. They did it obviously with the last Labour manifesto had a lot of spending pledges where they did not say how they were going to pay for it, and they got into a right muddle under Jeremy Corbyn about that, and I don't think that Keir Starmer wants to make that mistake again. We know that Labour want to fight on the issue of being credible on the economy, but yes, I don't think this trap to try and get Rishi Sunak to say where he is going to cut is going to work. But come when the manifesto does launch, he's absolutely right. If they do put it in their manifesto launch in any way, saying we are going to eventually abolish national insurance, they've absolutely got to say how they're going to do it, or Labour will rightly kick them for it.
I think it was, I've been reminded of this by a text, that the John Smith kept a copy of the 1992 Tory manifesto, and you kind of use it to hold the government hostage from the position of opposition. It's not quite the same tactic because I don't think Starmer's expecting to lose the election, but it's a sort of preemptive manifesto undermining, isn't it?
Yeah.
I tell you what's interesting, quite a few people picking up on the more desperate Sunak is, the quicker he reaches for Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think that's a hard and fast rule, but it's got some. They're both going into the general election, I think, successfully detaching themselves from their immediate predecessors. Sunak isn't really going to be held to account for much that Liz Truss did, and despite the best efforts of the Tories today, it was Trident and NATO. The commitment to Trident was in the 2019 manifesto. Sunak's really not fooling anyone except perhaps his own backbenchers. Starmer's not really going to be successfully allied with Jeremy Corbyn, not least because he's slung him out the Parliamentary Labour Party, but still they try.
Yeah, these attacks, we could say we see them on both sides,
yes,
don't
exactly.
we? We see both the Tories trying to attack Labour for Jeremy Corbyn and Labour trying to attack the Tories for Liz Truss. And I think that is one of the considerations that the Prime Minister, I'm told, is thinking about when he's thinking about whether to call an election. I was told by someone the other week that, yes, the longer we leave it, the more we can distance ourselves from Liz Truss and what happened. And I think that is a consideration.
Also,
so if he does go long,
the madder she gets, I would suggest. I mean, the more bonkers some of her pronouncements become, then the more distance. Because Sunak, for his faults, doesn't come across as crackers.
No, he doesn't. And he did say today, and he came out with lines which I don't think he's used for a while, saying that during the Tory leadership contest, he rightly, said that she would crash the economy, that we couldn't cut all these taxes in one go, just like she wanted to do. And he said, I was right then and I'm right now. So I think he does, to be fair, have a fairly good argument on this. He said at the time he wasn't going to do it. He said he was going to be responsible on the economy. He said Liz Truss was going to be a disaster, and she absolutely proved to be. So he is bang to rights on that, and I don't think that the Labour argument that Liz Truss is very much still a part of thinking in government is not quite going to wash.
It's mad though, isn't it? Because I've got to stop saying that. I've managed to get extraordinary out of my vocabulary this week, and I'm just describing everything as mad instead. But the people behind Sunak cheering were the people that essentially greased Liz Truss's passage to the leadership of the party.
True.
Even though he was the one saying, I know it went to the members. Didn't it
Yeah.
It did go to the members. It's so hard to remember.
Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss went to the members, but Rishi Sunak round 2.
No, I know that didn't go to the members.
Did not.
But who won among the MPs? Did Sunak beat Truss or did Truss beat Sunak? Can you remember?
Gosh, that's a good
Did they
question.
vote? Did the MPs just have one vote each in the overall? But anyway, he was saying that to the people who ended up voting for Liz Truss, this is all going to be insane. And now when he stands up and says, well, I said it was all going to be insane, all of the people behind him who voted for her are all whooping and cheering.
Exactly.
It's crazy. We don't talk about Stephen Flynn enough during this part of the week. It's entirely my fault.
We should.
We should. He's a very effective parliamentarian, and he highlights, I think, on a weekly basis, more effectively than his predecessor did. He highlights some of the grievances, I think, of Scottish nationalist SNP supporters. Rishi Sunak today probably didn't even notice that he essentially told the Scottish people what they want, in contradiction to the contribution of the man whose party governs Scotland. It was quite strange. Chick points this out. If Sunak seems to know what the Scottish people want, why doesn't he let us answer for ourselves?
That's a good point, but I don't think anybody would argue that the Scottish people don't care about schools, hospitals, jobs and taxes as well, of course. And, there is an argument that, ironically, the SNP are in the same boat as the Conservatives. They've been in power for so long, and a lot of people are, sadly fed up with the way things are going in Scotland. And I imagine that the SNP won't do quite as well at this election as they did at the last, not least because of Nicola Sturgeon and the fallout over what happened with her last week. But yes, look, I'm very much not a proponent for a second referendum. I do agree with that argument that we've had a vote. It's time to move on. Same with Brexit. That's my penance. Sorry to say the B word.
So nothing really landing there to that? Do you not think it was a bit of a...
No, and he gave a very short one sentence answer saying absolutely we've already had a vote. It's not one for us. I don't.
But nothing really landing for Starmer either, or Sunak. I mean, it was all a score draw all round, wasn't it? Or a no score draw.
Yeah,
a no score draw.
I'm going to give it 0-0. I don't think. Well, apart from the two, I'll give 1 point to each for both of those funny jokes at the start. But that's about all the points I'm going to give. Though I don't think that Keir Starmer was successful in drawing him into a trap anywhere. But either did I think the things that Rishi Sunak wanted to highlight. Taxes, inflation's down. He's just handed pensioners a nice pay rise. Well, is it moving the polls, Prime Minister? Of course it's not.
No, nothing is.
So absolutely nothing is. They're throwing the kitchen sink at absolutely everything.
And missing.
It's not working.
I mean, you speak to these people. Is despair setting in yet?
It is amongst a lot of people, yeah. And I think even cabinet ministers, I think, are starting to realise that the dial is just not shifting.
I can't remember this happening previously. I think I presume it happened to John Major. Bit,
I'm not old enough to remember.
No, I'm barely old enough to remember. Well, I'm plenty old enough to remember, but I wasn't paying that much attention at the time. But I think this far out from the election, the polls were not near where they are now.
And under Major, they did narrow ahead of the election.
Yes, exactly that.
And we were expecting them to narrow at some point, and they haven't done. So, yes, will we see them narrowing when we do get to an election? It's really hard to know because absolutely nothing the Conservatives are doing is really making any difference to these polls. So, yes.
Forgive my lack of gallantry, Natasha Clark, but you are old enough to remember who won among the MPs when it was Rishi Sunak versus Liz Truss.
No, I'm not. I'm clearly not.
I don't think age is your excuse.
So many leadership contests.
It was Rishi Sunak who got 137 votes from their parliamentary colleagues, and Liz Truss
so sorry.
landed
Mea culpa.
113. But that takes us back to the smoking vote and the future leadership contenders keeping a very close eye on the membership
exactly.
of the Tory party rather than the parliamentary
next,
party.
For sure.
And there it is, I suppose. To take away from that, the two leaders are both probably going to be able to easily weather attempts to tar them with the reputation of their predecessors, which brings us to Angela Rayner, briefly. I enjoyed Matthew Parris's piece in the Times today, which I would agree with, but of course the front page of the Times and the front page of the Daily Mail trying to resurrect this story, even if it turns out to be a hill of beans or a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. Anybody confused about why so much inflation and effort is being put into it got their answer today, because it allows Rishi Sunak just to throw it like a sort of like an animal in the zoo throwing excrement at the glass. He can just throw it across the House of Commons. It doesn't matter. And it gives his backbenchers something to cheer about.
Yeah, and I think it was, in fairness to him, I'm sort of glad he didn't go quite in as hard as Angela Rayner as some people may have expected him to do. So I think probably making a slight joke about it probably was the easier way to get around that subject of touching on it but not going too far into it, because Keir Starmer obviously had a response there saying it was a smear on a working class woman, and then he swiftly moved on. But Angela Rayner has taken the risk that Keir Starmer took over the Beergate curry row of, if I am found guilty, I will quit. And look, the revelations that are on the front page of the Times today, that this investigation into her affairs is slightly wider than we did think it was. There are lots of officers, according to the Times, 12 police officers working on this investigation. Whether it is a good use of taxpayers' money or not is a very, very different question. But, if she is found to have broken some rules, they're taking a big gamble, and Sir Keir Starmer, to me, seemed pretty confident that he thinks that she's going to be completely exonerated. And she looked quite comfortable there sitting next to him today.
Always that little remark. He was the director of public prosecution, so it's hard to imagine a CV better suited to reaching a conclusion on this kind of issue. But hey-ho, never say never. Natasha Clark, many thanks. 12:30 is the time. John Sopel up next to talk us through Donald Trump's latest travails on the other side of the Atlantic, joining me in the studio. You won't want to miss that. But first, Tim Humphrey has your headlines. 12:32 is the time. A few of you reflecting on the absence of questions about the situation in the Middle East at PMQs. I suspect, I think it is because the two leaders are largely singing from the same hymn sheet on that. So there's very little leverage, if you like, for Keir Starmer to come after Rishi Sunak for what the government is doing, and to a lesser extent, vice versa. I'm joined in the studio now by John Sopel, star of the newsagents, and indeed the newsagents USA. And until turning up in this parish, he was, of course, the BBC's North America editor, which means that you watch events in America still, John, with even more interest than the rest of us do. It's very hard to keep up with Donald Trump's legal travails, never mind his political situation?
So the legal situation is that he faces 4 criminal indictments with 91 separate criminal charges. And one of those cases, perhaps the least serious of them, which is that he paid off a porn star and never declared it as election expenses, has actually started in New York now. The other 3 cases might not happen before the presidential election. But we are treated to the spectacle now of Donald Trump as a criminal defendant having to appear in court just like any other criminal defendant in a dingy courthouse in Manhattan on the 15th floor as potential jurors are going to be examined to see whether they are fit to sit on the jury to try Donald Trump. And the mighty, powerful, big, muscular Donald Trump looks a rather shrunken figure in this courtroom.
And that is not what some people were expecting or predicting. There's a lot of talk about how it would embolden him or play well to his. But I like the way you've described it as something that his supporters won't like the look of.
Well, I mean, there have been reports that in the first 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, that at times he's fallen asleep. His eyes have kind of closed, his shoulders have slumped, his head's tilted forward and his mouth has lolled open. That is not the image that Donald Trump wants to project. And, all the court reporters that are there are reporting on it. It's not being televised, so you're not going to get that television drama.
Yeah.
And it's obviously difficult to swear in a jury of 12 people who don't have a view on Donald Trump who can promise to be impartial. Because Donald Trump himself, having tried and failed to get the case delayed and kicked into the long grass, he's then gone after the judge, he's gone after the clerk of the court, he's gone after the witnesses, and it has led to the judge warning Trump that he could be in contempt of court, because apparently yesterday he was sitting glowering at potential jurors, and he said, and the judge, whereas Donald Trump has been able to run roughshod over the political rules, over the judicial rules, it's more difficult. The judge is in charge in that court.
And I mean, to that point, 7 jurors sworn in already. They need to find 5 more and 6 substitutes.
Yeah.
Right, the process not quite as easy as it would be in a normal case.
No, well, not as quite as easy in a normal case. And this also speaks to the American justice system, whereby, there is a kind of immense vetting going on of anyone who's going to sit on the jury. There'll be background checks that the prosecution and the defence will be doing to find out whether they've got allegiances or kind of have been paying money to a political party or whatever. So that will be going on. But it looks like the actual opening statements in the case could come as soon as next Monday. And the huge question, will Donald Trump's defence team dare to put him on the stand to give evidence? Because that would be astonishing. But you're going to hear from his former lawyer, Michael Cohen.
Well, just remind us what's happened to Michael Cohen with reference to this story in recent years.
So Michael Cohen himself was Trump's personal attorney. He lied on Donald Trump's behalf and was sent to prison, and then was let out of prison, but has since then become absolutely determined. And Donald Trump
lied about this case, about the Stormy Daniels.
Yes, and that no money was paid, and it was and Donald Trump. I mean, and Donald Trump has lied about it as well. I mean, and I say that advisedly.
Yes.
Donald Trump was on Air Force One coming back from Mar-a-Lago. He was asked, "Did you know anything about the $130,000 paid to Stormy Daniels?" He said no. Michael Cohen has since produced the checks signed by Donald J. Trump. So Donald Trump hasn't exactly. I mean,
it set me off again.
I know.
So his defence then becomes, oh, okay, yes, I did know about it, but I was paying my legal fees. I didn't know that this was the money.
It was a business expense.
Yes.
It wasn't a political expense. It was just a kind of mistake in the accounting line, and that is where Donald Trump has a point. Because there are 2 types of offences in the US criminal justice system. There is a misdemeanor and there are felony offences. And the district attorney, Alvin Bragg in New York, has gone after Trump that this is a felony offence, i.e. could be imprisonable rather than just a slap on the wrist. It's, I guess, the difference between a district court and a crown court over what you can prosecute over. And I think that Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, has set the bar very high Whereas most people would say, actually, what Trump did, yeah, of course it was wrong. Of course it was. But, frankly, let's not pretend this is something that he should be imprisoned for. And that's why I say it is the weakest of the 4 cases. The other ones about election interference and squirreling away secret documents are much more serious. But I don't think those will come to a conclusion before the presidential election in November.
OK. So this one is not about electoral interference. Sorry, I'm being a bit dozy.
This all happened before the election.
No, I know, but isn't it partly... Isn't it like saying if people had known the truth about Stormy Daniels, that would have affected the election, so paying her off to keep her out of the news was electoral interference?
But say compared to ringing up the Secretary of State in Georgia and saying, I want you to find me 11,780 votes, please.
Okay.
It seems like small beer. And so this is the porn star case, the others are the election interference case. But yes, you're absolutely right. The reason why Donald Trump didn't want this public, there is a reason for it. He didn't want it to come out that he'd paid off a porn star who was alleging an affair and had paid her off $130,000 to keep her stumm.
He still denies the affair.
Yeah, he does, and she's quite... but there's also going to be another former Playboy model who alleged affair, and there's going to be email exchanges, there are tapes. So, potentially... Everyone thinks that, look, Donald Trump supporters, his base is absolutely rock solid. That's true, it is. But there are an awful lot of people in the middle.
Yeah, you don't know how
still
big
in America.
the base is.
Yes, and so what matters are independent-minded Republicans, independents, people who just kind of are of no party, but just want to hear. And if they see that Donald Trump is this kind of rather shrunken figure and just looks like any other person up before the beak in Manhattan,
that's really
then it's serious.
In the words of Meghan Trainor, John, it's all about that base. I didn't realise that he is required to be there every day. So that's 6 to 8 weeks probably off the campaign completely.
Yes. And I mean, for example, next Wednesday, he has got an appeal before the Supreme Court that he wants to get these other criminal cases dismissed, claiming that he has presidential immunity. And the judge in the case in New York said, tough, you're here. You've got to be here every day. So what he's doing is every time he comes into court, he sort of stands in front of the kind of crash barrier and will speak to the press and give his soundbite that this is a weaponized justice system. This is all grotesquely unfair. And dear American people, if they can come after me, they can come after you. I am the bulwark that is keeping these kind of evil people at bay. He'll do that. And he's also doing something else, which is that every time the court finishes, I mean, yesterday he went to a bodega in Harlem to do a campaign stop.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't have thought Harlem would be particularly strong for his base, but it was a way of kind of bringing up the problems of law and order in New York, which was a way of jabbing the district attorney. So every time after, he is going to use the courtroom and the courthouse as a backdrop for his election campaign because he has no other option.
Do you think he fell asleep?
Yeah, he dozed off.
Genuinely nodded off.
He was, he's a 78-year-old guy,
yeah.
And he's, and he had a little bit of a kip.
And well, that's the most powerful piece of evidence, isn't it? For the how is this going to look to people who think he's a cross between Rambo and Jesus?
Yes, and the important thing is that both Trump and Biden show real signs of age.
Yes,
the difference.
Don't we all?
Yeah, exactly. No, the difference between Trump and Biden is that Trump always seems energetic and loud, whereas Biden's voice sounds thin and raspy, and he can't really get his voice project. And I think that is, and if you get Trump dozing off in court and everyone reporting it as such, I think that is potentially damaging because the image that he so loves to project is strength and invincibility, and being a defendant in a criminal court case is humbling.
And finally, to that point, if he is found guilty, is jail guaranteed a short sentence? Or
rich people don't go to prison that much in America. I mean, really, it's kind of that's a silly generalisation, but I'm sure it would not be that. It would be a fine, and then it would be appealed, and it will take the wheels of justice in America. move incredibly slowly if you've got enough money to pay lawyers to intervene at every step in the way, and Donald Trump has.
And yet, I mean, there's stuff we haven't even touched upon, and we're almost out of time because there are questions over the company.
I thought I was coming in here for 2 minutes.
You could come in for 10 hours and not touch the size of it because you couldn't. There were questions over the bond guarantor as well, so he couldn't raise the money himself, despite being.
Saying he's got 300 million in the bank.
Man. Yeah, he got it. I thought he had it in his pocket.
Yeah.
So he couldn't raise the money himself, and then the company that did, then he couldn't raise it from traditional means, so an untraditional means came forward, and now there's questions over whether or not that
bond is worth anything.
Solid.
Yeah.
It's not this case that could see some of his assets being seized. That's a different case. Or
those are two different cases.
Just madness, man.
So we've talked about the criminal indictments. I haven't even gone on to the civil cases that he was found to have raped E. Jean Carroll, and that was a civil case. That wasn't a criminal case. And also that he falsely inflated fraudulently the values of various Trump properties so that he could pay back loans on very much lower interest rates. And so he has committed a fraud there. And it is that he has to pay this huge bond for, because he's been fined a massive amount. And he's trying to appeal that, of course, because Trump appeals everything and plays everything as long as he possibly can. But it is possible that the Marshal Service will go round and say, Trump Tower, can we have the keys, please?
Jeez. A quick word on Liz Truss while I've got you. Who has called for Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States of America?
Yeah, well, she appeared at that rally in just outside Washington a month or two ago, and
with Steve Bannon.
And one or two of the people around Bannon were not over. I mean, even though she was saying very Bannonite things and very Trumpian things about the state and the deep state and, the conspiracy against the people and all the rest of it, were not overly impressed by her grasp of some of the detail, shall we say.
I'm sure they'll change their tune when they read her book.
Maybe.
John Sopel, thanks very much indeed. The Newsagents, and of course the Newsagents USA coming soon. To a podcast provider. Get it all off Global Player. Get it all off the Global Player app. We refocus attention next, having a little look at what is happening right now in Gaza, because understandably attention shifting away from there to other elements of Middle Eastern tension. But I'm keen to find out how distraction seems too mild a word, but how those events have impacted or not upon the people still caught in that crossfire. It's 12:45. It's 12:48, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I understandably, given the events of the weekend and the questions still hanging over what Benjamin Netanyahu is likely to do in response to that unprecedented attack by Iran, inadequate amounts of attention that are being paid to what's happening on the ground in Gaza, and inadequate in large part because of the difficulty or the impossibility of Western news organisations getting their people into the territory. That already inadequate coverage has perhaps inevitably been diminished still further. And yet the United Nations and other organisations warning repeatedly and ever more loudly of imminent, if not already extant, famine. We've been lucky enough to make contact with Tess Ingram, who's a UNICEF spokesperson who left Gaza on Monday and is therefore one of the few external humanitarian aid workers to have got into the north of the Strip recently. And Tess is speaking to us from Amman in Jordan. I suppose we begin with the big question, which may not be answerable, Tess, which is how much aid is getting in to Gaza and how much of it is getting to the places where it's most desperately needed?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question at the moment, James, because still nowhere near enough aid is getting into the Gaza Strip. And that's an enormous problem because, as you say, we're on the precipice of a famine. It could happen at any moment. So if you look at the numbers of the trucks coming in, In March, we averaged about 150 trucks a day. In the first 2 weeks of April, that's gone up slightly to about 200 trucks a day, but it is still nowhere near enough. And as a good measure, we used to get 500 trucks in a day before the escalation in hostilities. So we're still less than half. And of course, the needs have skyrocketed. So it's very tricky. And then that little aid that we do get in, we have all sorts of challenges on the ground trying to get it to the people that need it, particularly in the north.
Forgive me for an obvious, or rather it may be obvious to you, it's not obvious to me, but why is it so reduced? What is stopping more aid from getting in? Is it there and is being prevented from ingress, or is it not there for whatever reason? Why is it not easier to massively increase this supply?
So we have a lot of aid in position to go in. There's currently about 700 trucks sitting on the tarmac in Egypt waiting in a long queue to enter. But the challenge is this very slow and complex screening process at the border. So everything gets screened. It takes days, and it's very opaque. We don't have a lot of visibility on what's happening in that process or what's going to come out the other side when, which then makes it very difficult for us to plan distribution. So it's logistical challenges, James, that could easily be fixed to scale up the number of trucks coming in.
So what is the unspoken reason behind that then? What is the suspicion or the fear that if it is easily fixed, why is it not being fixed?
Well, we're asking that question and have been for 6 months because, we know that these crossings can operate at a higher capacity. We're asking for more trucks to come in. It's not happening. We're asking for more crossings to be opened. There's 2 other access paths that could be opened. Not happening. So, I'm not going to speculate.
No,
but,
fair enough. So, I understand. Yeah. I understand. What defines famine? Tess? Well, because people have been hearing now for some time that the people in Gaza are on the brink, on the precipice of famine. What pushes the needle into that territory?
So it's a very specific set of data that's needed for this international group to declare a famine. They're the global experts on when that threshold is breached. And there's a number of measures. One is kind of food insecurity, one is the number of malnourished children, and the other one is mortality, so how many people are dying. And in February, we came very close to that threshold in the north, and that's why the UN said that famine could happen at any moment now. And based on what I saw up there on Sunday, we are close, if not there.
That was my next question. Can you give us a sort of eyewitness account of what you saw in both sort of human and material terms?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's important to note is the destruction. As you drive through, that's the first thing that you see, and the sheer scale of how much has been damaged or just completely reduced to rubble is shocking. There is not a lot left in the north of Gaza, James, and I think that is, an important part of a conversation we'll have in the future as to how do people return to their homes in that area. But for now, that destruction is shocking, and people are really trying to live amongst it, those that remain there. And it also explains why they haven't been able to get a lot of food, because all of their systems that they depend on have been destroyed. Plus, aid has been restricted to the area. And then we went to the hospital. Kamal Adwan Hospital is one of the main points that's treating children for acute malnutrition. And there, it's almost lost for words. Yeah. I saw... babies, toddlers, small children who were all severely malnourished. 35-day-old baby who had lost weight since being born because the mother couldn't breastfeed because she was malnourished. That baby's now just over a kilo in weight. A 2.5-year-old, very sick, very thin, and a 7-year-old girl who was very malnourished, and we ended up actually medically evacuating her on our return from that mission. So we managed to bring her back to the south with us so that she can get the treatment that she needs.
It beggars belief, some of what you describe, and I hesitate to ask the next question because I can speculate on what the answer would be. But what does how does this end for them? What would they consider to be light at the end of the tunnel now? And you should probably, if you can, incorporate into your answer the concerns about Israel going into Rafah.
So I think for the people in the north, they just need aid. That's what they want. I spoke to a mother and I said to her, "What food have you managed to get?" And she just kind of shrugged at me. And so I was kind of pushing her for an answer. I said, "Bread?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh, no, haven't seen bread in."
So this is visceral, isn't it? I'm sitting here in a studio and I'm asking you questions that in my mind are quite complicated. But if you're hungry, if your baby is losing weight, there's nothing beyond that. There's no light at the end of the tunnel or end game or chapter 2. We need to eat.
Exactly. And it's as simple as that because, you know, for them, we're all having these complex discussions about ceasefires, and to them it's simple. It's just, how do I survive today? How do I make sure my baby survives the night? And that is so reliant on aid in the north. Now, in the south, the situation's different. Aid does get there, nowhere near enough, but we are getting aid to the people of Rafah. But they're all terrified.
Right.
They know, they hear the news of a ground offensive in Rafah. And, you know, some of the people I met have already moved 6 or 7 times over the last 6 months. They don't want to be displaced again. They don't know where they would go. They're aware of the level of destruction north of them. And they're frightened. There was one woman, actually, who I met in January and then again when I returned last week. And you could see that she was losing hope. She said to me, you know, we're kind of at a point of despair that we don't feel like we're going to make it through now.
I suppose, given what we just said about hunger, and you draw, of course, the important distinction between the north and the south, but when you describe the destruction, does your mind even begin yet to turn to the question of what rebuilding is going to involve? You're talking about people living on a bomb site, living in rubble. You use the phrase because there is no other phrase to use. They're returning to their homes, but they're not, are they? Because their homes aren't there. So what can we get a handle on the scale of what, if it ever happens, a rebuilding process would look like and involve?
Billions of dollars and many years. You know, I went through Khan Yunis as well, which is the area where Israeli ground troops have just withdrawn from, and that is also intense level of destruction. 8 out of 10 schools in Gaza are either damaged or destroyed. So it's, you know, it's not just homes, it's schools and it's hospitals and it's markets and offices, it's everything. And, you know, one of the things I was thinking about while I was driving around the north was, this could very easily be my hometown in Australia. You know, it was all of the things that we have in our communities, cinemas, shops, rubble, and people just standing in the blackened dirt around it.
Tess Ingram, thank you. That seems an inappropriate... Well, actually, no, before you go, do you fear for your own safety while you're there?
Yes. You know, I was in an incident where the car that I was in was hit by live ammunition, and that is just yet another example of the fact that the systems that are meant to protect humanitarian workers, they're not functioning properly. The World Central Kitchen colleagues were killed. This is happening regularly where humanitarian workers are put in harm's way. So, yeah, it is a very dangerous operating environment, and it is affecting the aid that we can bring to children.
Of course. Well, take care. Tess Ingram, UNICEF spokesperson, as I said, who was in Gaza until Monday, one of the few external humanitarian aid workers to have visited the north of the Strip recently, speaking to us there live from Amman. That's it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now it's Sheila Fogarty. 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 It's Sheila Fogarty.